June 1536, Hunsdon House, Hertfordshire. A young woman of 20 sits in a room with men from the Privy Council. She has been ill for weeks, headaches, stomach pains, sleeplessness that has left her face drawn and her hands unsteady. On the table in front of her is a document. It is written in the language of statute and theology, and it asks her to declare that her parents' marriage was unlawful, that she is illegitimate, and that her father is the supreme authority over the church in England. Her mother, who spent a lifetime refusing to sign anything like it, has been dead for 5 months. The men are waiting. She has refused before. She has been told what refusal will cost her now. The pen is in her hand. The room is quiet. She signs. The commissioners take the document. The room empties, and whatever sound a person makes when they have just helped destroy the thing they loved most, and their mother's honor, their own name, their place in the world, is not recorded in any archive. The public story of the Tudors is a story told through Henry VIII, his wives, his appetites, his break with Rome. But inside the palaces and the households, behind the statutes and the oaths of allegiance, a different story was unfolding, a private one, a story not about the king's marriages, but about what those marriages did to his children. This is the story of Mary and Elizabeth Tudor, two daughters born to the highest position in England and then systematically removed from it by their own father. It spans 4 decades, two queens, and a pattern of damage that shaped not just two lives, but the future of the English crown itself. That document, the one Mary signed in June of 1536, was not the beginning of the story. It was the end of one. The end of a resistance that had lasted years, the end of a daughter's refusal to help her father erase her mother and herself, the end of whatever private conviction had held a young woman together while every institution in the kingdom was turned against her. But to understand how a princess of England could be brought to that room, to that sheet of state language, to that silence afterward, you have to go back further than the submission. You have to go back to the dynasty itself, to the particular fear that ran beneath its magnificence, to the anxiety about blood and succession that made Henry VIII capable of doing what he did not merely to his wives, but to his daughters. This is the story of two women who were born into the highest position the English speaking world could offer and then systematically removed from it by their own father, using Parliament, the church, the royal household, and the machinery of law to convert living daughters into political inconveniences. It is the story of Mary and Elizabeth Tudor, told across decades and through the lives of everyone caught inside the destruction: mothers, ministers, ambassadors, household servants, and the two girls themselves. It is the story of what it cost them, not merely in title, but in selfhood, to be the daughters Henry tried, at different moments and for different reasons, to write out of his succession and out of existence. The House of Tudor did not arrive on the English throne through inheritance in the usual sense. It arrived through war. When Henry VII defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field on the 22nd of August, 1485, he claimed the crown not because his bloodline was the strongest, it was not, but because he was the last credible alternative standing. His claim ran through his mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, whose descent from John of Gaunt was legitimate in blood but had been barred from the succession by an old parliamentary provision. The Beauforts had been declared legitimate by Richard II and then re-legitimized by Henry IV, but with a clause, inserted later and bitterly contested, excluding them from the royal line. Henry VII's title to the throne, in other words, was arguable from the day he won it. He knew this, his mother knew this, and every political decision the early Tudors made was shaped, at some fundamental level, by the knowledge that their grip on England rested not on centuries of unchallenged right, but on a single battlefield victory and the absence of a better candidate. That insecurity is the foundation of everything that follows in this story. It explains why Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, not only for affection, though affection may have come, but to fuse the warring Lancastrian and Yorkist lines and close the door on rival claims. It explains why he was relentless with money, meticulous with alliances, and brutal with pretenders. Two impostors, Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, had tested the new dynasty within its first decade, and both had found enough support to raise armies. The lesson was not subtle. A Tudor king without a clear, undisputed male heir was a Tudor king inviting the return of chaos. The memory of the Wars of the Roses was not ancient history, it was living memory. The men who served at the Tudor court had fathers and grandfathers who had fought on one side or the other, switched allegiance when the wind changed, and buried sons on muddy fields in the Midlands. The lesson those wars had taught was plain and pitiless. When the succession is uncertain, England bleeds. Henry VIII, born on the 28th of June, 1491, at Greenwich Palace, did not begin his reign as a man haunted by that lesson. He began it as something close to the opposite. Young, athletic, charismatic, intellectually formidable, and possessed of a confidence that bordered on the theatrical. He was tall for the age, powerfully built, accomplished in music, theology, and the joust, and surrounded by a court that had every reason to believe the Tudor future was secure. His father had left him a full treasury, a stable realm, and a Spanish bride of impeccable credentials. The coronation was magnificent. The tournaments were extravagant. The early years of the reign projected an image of golden certainty, a young king and a worthy queen. The dynasty renewed, the succession merely a matter of time. Catherine of Aragon, born on the 16th of December, 1485, was the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. The monarchs who had unified Spain, expelled the Moors, and financed Columbus. She had been raised in one of the most formidable courts in Europe, educated in Latin, French, theology, and law, and trained for exactly the role she now occupied: consort to a powerful king, mother to a line of princes. She had come to England first in 1501 at 15 to marry Henry's older brother Arthur, Prince of Wales. Arthur died 5 months later, in April 1502, at Ludlow Castle. Catherine spent the next 7 years in a kind of diplomatic limbo, betrothed to the younger Henry but never quite married. Her dowry disputed, her household shrinking, her status uncertain. When Henry VII died in 1509 and the young Henry VIII chose to marry her, it was received as an act of both political wisdom and personal generosity. A papal dispensation from Julius II had already been obtained, authorizing the marriage on the grounds that Catherine's union with Arthur had never been consummated, a claim Catherine maintained to her dying day and that would later become the most consequential assertion of her life. The early marriage was, by most accounts, a genuine partnership. Henry was 18, Catherine nearly 24. She was poised, devout, well-read, and politically astute. He admired her. She managed his household, represented him as regent when he went to war in France in 1513, and oversaw the English victory at the Battle of Flodden in his absence. The court saw a king and queen who appeared united, affectionate, and crucially unfertile. The trouble, when it came from the place it always came from in Tudor politics: the nursery. Catherine's pregnancies were frequent and devastating. A stillborn daughter arrived in January 1510. A son, Henry, Duke of Cornwall, was born on the 1st of January 1511, and the kingdom celebrated the bonfires in London, a grand tournament at Westminster, ambassadors sending joyful dispatches to their courts. The boy died 52 days later. Another son came in 1513, stillborn or dead within hours. The records are ambiguous. A further pregnancy in 1514 produced a son who lived only briefly. There may have been yet another lost pregnancy in 1515. By the time Mary was born, on the 18th of February 1516 at Greenwich Palace, Catherine had endured at least 5 failed pregnancies in 6 years, and the court understood what that pattern meant. It meant the queen was moving past the years of reliable fertility. It meant the one surviving child was a girl. And it meant that the question Henry VII had spent his entire reign trying to settle, the question of who would come next, was open again. There is something about that sequence of losses that demands attention before the story can continue. Each failed pregnancy was not merely a private grief, it was a public event. The court watched, ambassadors reported. The king's disappointment was noted, measured, and interpreted. Catherine bore each loss with the stoicism her upbringing demanded, but the cumulative effect was corrosive, not only on her body, which was visibly aging under the strain, but on her position. A queen who could not produce a living son was, in the political calculus of the age, a queen whose usefulness was running out. That Catherine was also proud, intelligent, devout, and beloved by the English public did not, in the end, protect her. It only made what happened to her more difficult for others to watch. Mary's birth was not received as a disaster. There was relief, ceremony, and genuine parental warmth. Catherine invested herself in the child with an intensity that reflected both of maternal devotion and dynastic urgency. This daughter was, for the moment, all the succession had. Mary was christened with full royal ceremony at the Church of the Observant Friars in Greenwich, Cardinal Wolsey standing as her godfather. She was given her own household, her own attendants, and eventually her own court. In 1525, at 9 years old, she was sent to Ludlow Castle in the Welsh Marches as nominal head of the Council of Wales. an echo of what had been done for Prince Arthur before her, a move that signaled Henry was willing for now to treat his daughter as something close to an heir presumptive. She was educated at the highest level: Latin, French, Spanish, music, theology, the humanist curriculum that Catherine herself had been raised on. She was discussed in diplomatic circles as a potential bride for the Dauphin of France, for the Emperor Charles VIII, her own cousin, and for the King of Scotland. In the language of dynastic politics, Mary was a valuable commodity. She was also, in the language of Henry's deepest fear, not enough. She had rank, education, ceremony, and royal visibility. She did not have the one thing that would have made her safe, which was being male. That distinction between everything Mary was and the one thing she was not is the hinge on which the whole story turns. By the mid-1520s, Henry had begun to construct an explanation for his predicament that would reshape the English church, the English state, and the lives of both his daughters. He decided that his marriage to Catherine was cursed, that the papal dispensation allowing him to marry his brother's widow had been insufficient, that the passage in Leviticus, "If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing, they shall be childless," applied to him directly. The fact that he was not childless, that Mary existed and was demonstrably alive, did not trouble the theological argument. The argument required a son. The absence of a son was proof enough of divine displeasure. Anne Boleyn enters the story here, and she enters it not as a simple temptress — the popular version is too crude for the reality — but as a destabilizing event of extraordinary consequence. Anne, born around 1501 or possibly as late as 1507, the date remaining disputed among historians, was the daughter of Sir Thomas Boleyn and Lady Elizabeth Howard. She had been educated at the courts of the Archduchess Margaret in the Low Countries and of the French Queen Claude, and she returned to England polished, ambitious, fluent in French, and possessed of a wit and a self-assurance that set her apart from the quieter women of the English court. She was not, by the standards her enemies later used, conventionally beautiful. She was dark-haired, dark-eyed, slender, and sharp-featured, compelling rather than pretty, and aware of the difference. Her intelligence was real. Her political instincts were formidable, and her refusal to become merely a royal mistress, a role her oldest sister Mary Boleyn had already occupied and been discarded from, changed the course of English history. Had Anne accepted a quiet liaison, Catherine might have remained queen and Mary might have remained princess. But Anne held out for marriage, and once Henry decided he wanted to marry her, the private desire became a constitutional crisis. Thomas Wolsey, the cardinal and Lord Chancellor who had dominated English politics for over a decade, was tasked with securing a papal annulment of the marriage to Catherine. When Rome refused, and in large part because Catherine's nephew, the Emperor Charles VIII, had effective military control over Pope Clement VII and was not inclined to let his aunt be discarded. The project moved from ecclesiastical negotiation to something far more radical. What happened next was not merely a divorce. It was a revolution in the relationship between the English crown and the church, and it was accomplished through Parliament. The Reformation Parliament, sitting in various sessions from 1529 to 1536, did not simply ratify decisions already made at court. It became the instrument by which Henry transferred religious authority from the Pope to himself, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and created a legal framework in which the king's marital choices could be enforced as statute law. Thomas Cromwell, who rose to power as Wolsey fell from grace and died in 1530, was the architect of this legislative revolution. Thomas Cranmer, appointed Archbishop of Canterbury in March 1533, was its ecclesiastical voice. Between them, they built a system in which a king's conscience, or what he called his conscience, could override centuries of papal authority and redefine the terms on which his children were legitimate or not. To understand how two princesses could be turned into bastards by their own father, you have to understand that moment. The moment the Tudor succession stopped being a family matter and became a legislative project, managed by ministers, ratified by Parliament, and enforced by household officials who understood that the king's domestic will and the king's political will were now the same thing. Henry himself, by this point in the story, requires more than a single dimension. The popular image, the bloated, tyrannical, wife-killing, belongs to his later years. In the early 1530s, he was still physically impressive, still intellectually engaged, and still capable of projecting a kind of terrifying reasonableness. He did not see himself as a monster. He saw himself as a king doing what the succession demanded, guided by conscience and theology. That self image is important because it explains the particular quality of the cruelty he inflicted on his daughters. Henry did not rage at Mary in the manner of a domestic abuser. He constructed legal and institutional frameworks that made her degradation look orderly, justified, and to those who dared not dissent, inevitable. He turned domestic grievance into public statute. He did not merely want obedience, he wanted the law, the church, the court, and the household to mirror his wishes so completely that disobedience looked not like courage, but like treason. Catherine of Aragon's role in the family dynamic was foundational. She was not a passive victim. She was proud, devout, educated, legally sharp, and absolutely unwilling to concede that her marriage to Henry was invalid. She appealed to Rome. She refused to accept any title other than queen. She insisted, publicly and privately, that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated and that her union with Henry was therefore legitimate and sacramental. What Catherine wanted was not simply to remain queen, though she wanted that fiercely, but to preserve Mary's legitimacy. If Catherine's marriage fell, Mary fell with it. Mother and daughter understood this with perfect clarity, and Catherine's refusal to bend was sustained as much by maternal protectiveness as by personal conviction. The separation of Catherine from Mary, they were kept apart for the last years of Catherine's life, forbidden to visit each other, is one of the deepest wounds in the story, because the daughter's later resistance was fueled as much by loyalty to her mother as by loyalty to herself. Mary, at 13 and 14, was already formed by that loyalty. She was serious, proud, deeply pious, emotionally intense, and possessed of a stubbornness that her father would have recognized as his own. She had been raised as a princess. She had been told by her mother and by the world that she was legitimate, that her parents' marriage was valid, and that her claim to the succession was real. Now the institutions of the English state were telling her the opposite, and she refused to accept it. She would not call herself Lady Mary instead of Princess Mary. She would not acknowledge Anne as queen. She would not accept that her mother's marriage had been unlawful. Those refusals, sustained across years and at great personal cost, are the emotional spine of the first half of the story. Mary's arc is the clearest in the entire film. Cherished princess, broken daughter, forced submitter, embattled claimant, queen. But that clarity should not disguise the anguish that lay underneath each stage. She was not a political automaton. She was a young woman, losing everything she had been taught to believe about herself. Anne Boleyn's role in the family dynamic was catalytic and ultimately tragic. She was intelligent, politically consequential, allied with the reformist factions at court, and for a brief period, the answer to Henry's dynastic crisis. What Anne wanted is harder to reduce to a single desire: influence, security, the preservation of her own child's claim, perhaps genuine religious reform, certainly survival. Her hostility toward Mary was real, but the outline should resist making Anne the story's simple persecutor, because the larger mechanism was always Henry's. Anne needed Mary diminished because Mary's claim competed with Elizabeth's. The personal animosity was woven into the structural logic, and Anne's own fall, arrest, trial, and execution on the 19th of May, 1536, matters in this story not primarily for what it did to Anne, but for what it did to the 2-year-old Elizabeth, who inherited its consequences before she could understand what a mother was, let alone what it meant to lose one to the executioner's sword. Elizabeth, born on the 7th of September, 1533, at Greenwich Palace, entered a world that had just been remade for her benefit. She was the child of the new marriage, the new queen, the new religious settlement. She was christened with elaborate ceremony. Mary was pointedly not invited, and declared heir presumptive by the Act of Succession that Parliament passed in 1534. But she was not a son. The disappointment was political before it was personal. Anne's position depended on producing a male heir, and Elizabeth's sex meant that the justification for everything Henry had destroyed, Catherine's marriage, Mary's status, England's relationship with Rome, was still incomplete. Elizabeth's early psychology, insofar as it can be reconstructed, was shaped by that incompleteness. She was born into prominence and uncertainty in equal measure. Her mother would be dead before Elizabeth turned 3. Her title would be stripped before she turned 4. Her father would remain emotionally remote for most of her childhood. What she learned in those early years was not resistance. She was too young for that, but watchfulness, the art of saying nothing, the habit of reading the room before the room could read her. Cromwell was the hand that translated all of this into documents, oaths, and household discipline. Born around 1485, the son of a Putney brewer, he had risen through talent, continental experience, legal acuity, and an extraordinary capacity for administrative detail. He understood how to make a king's desire look like the natural order of things. He understood oaths, submissions, forms of address, and the daily enforcement of precedents. It was Cromwell who would press Mary to sign her submission. It was Cromwell who managed the daughter's demotion as a bureaucratic process. His own trajectory, from indispensable enforcer to victim of the same system he had built, executed in 1540, mirrors the larger pattern of a regime that consumed its own instruments. Cranmer provided the theological scaffolding. As archbishop, he declared Catherine's marriage null, validated Anne's, and later, after Anne's fall, declared that marriage invalid too. The children of both unions were, in law, the products of void marriages, which is to say, illegitimate. Cranmer represented the moment when the church became not a shelter from state violence, but a participant in it. Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, watched from the edge of all of this and wrote it down. Appointed by Charles V, Catherine's nephew, Chapuis arrived in England in 1529 and remained for over 15 years a constant, shrewd, and deeply partisan observer of the Tudor court's transformation. He was an advocate for Catherine and Mary, a channel of communication between them when direct contact was forbidden, and an intelligence gatherer of the First Order. His dispatches to the emperor, detailed, politically engaged, grounded in conversations with courtiers, servants, and sympathizers, are among the most important surviving sources for what happened inside the court during these years. Chapuis gives this story its outside eye, the sense that Europe was watching Henry unmake his own daughters, that foreign courts were appalled, and that the watching changed nothing. He also provides something rarer, some glimpses of Mary's private state of mind, reported through intermediaries, in which the defiance and the anguish existed simultaneously. Through Chapuis, we hear of a young woman who refused to bend in public and who wept in private, who maintained her dignity before the Sheltons and then collapsed into illness when the pressure became more than a body could bear. Jane Seymour, who would become Henry's third queen, matters in this story not because of her own ambitions or personality. She was, by most accounts, quiet, compliant, and unremarkable in the way the court preferred after the turbulence of Anne, but because she was structurally decisive. Jane came from a family of rising gentry in Wiltshire, a woman who had served in both Catherine's and Anne's households and who understood the court well enough to know that her value lay in docility and fertility. She would marry Henry on the 30th of May, 1536, just 11 days after Anne's execution. Her gentleness toward Mary, in some accounts, offered a brief thaw in the relentless cold of the previous years. It was Jane who reportedly interceded with Henry to allow Mary back into a measure of favor, though only after Mary had already signed the devastating submission. But Jane's true significance was biological. She gave birth to Edward on the 12th of October, 1537, in Hampton Court Palace, and died 12 days later of what was almost certainly puerperal fever. She was 28 or 29 years old. Edward's arrival was the event Henry had spent a quarter of a century engineering. The longed-for son had come. The kingdom had its heir, and Mary and Elizabeth, already bastardized by statute, were now confirmed in their subordination by the simple, unanswerable fact of a living male child who cried in a royal cradle at Hampton Court. Edward himself, born into that suffocating weight of expectation, would grow into a serious, Protestant, intellectually precocious boy who adored his tutors and seldom saw his father. He would reign as king from 1547 and die at 15 in 1553, and in his final months he would attempt yet another bypass of his sister's claims, the device for the succession that tried to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne. Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final wife, married in 1543, would play a quieter but essential role in the last act of the daughter's story. She was a twice-widowed woman of 31, well-educated, genuinely kind, and Protestant in her sympathies, and under her careful stewardship, the royal household became a place where Mary and Elizabeth could coexist with their father in something resembling domestic proximity. It was during Parr's time as queen that the Third Succession Act of 1543 restored both daughters to the line of succession, behind Edward, but present, named, and once again inheritors of the crown. That restoration, imperfect as it was, Henry never fully re-legitimized either daughter. He merely reinserted them into the order, would prove to be the legal foundation on which both women eventually built their reigns. And the Sheltons, Lady Anne Shelton and Sir John Shelton, administered the daily texture of the humiliation in the years before any of that restoration was imaginable. Placed in charge of Elizabeth's household at Hatfield, they enforced the new order in the small grinding transactions of domestic life: who sat where, who was addressed how, who ate first, who could receive visitors, and who was watched. The cruelty of this story was often not spectacular. It was procedural, repetitive, and intimate. It happened in rooms, at mealtimes, through forms of address and denials of courtesy, and it was no less destructive for being quiet. The Sheltons were not making history. They were merely following instructions. But the history they helped make lived on in the bodies and the memories of two girls who would one day become queens. The family, if it could still be called that, was taking shape, or rather being reshaped, by the autumn of 1533. Catherine had been separated from Henry and would never see him again. She had been removed from the royal palaces and sent to increasingly remote residences, first to Buckden in Huntingdonshire, later to Kimbleton Castle in Cambridgeshire, where her household shrank and her health declined. Mary was still calling herself princess, still refusing to yield and still being punished for that refusal in the daily management of her life. Anne was queen, triumphant but fragile, aware that she had delivered a daughter when a son had been expected. Elizabeth was an infant in a cradle at Hatfield, oblivious to the political architecture being erected around her small body. And Parliament was preparing to legislate a succession that would make Elizabeth the legal future of England and reduce her older half-sister to nothing. The court in those months was performing the change with the precision of a stage crew between acts. Oaths of allegiance to the new succession were demanded from every person of consequence in the realm. Lords, bishops, clergy, municipal officers, anyone whose compliance was needed to make the new order stick. The old Queen's supporters were watched, pressured, and in some cases imprisoned. Sir Thomas More, who refused the oath, would go to the Tower. Bishop John Fisher, who refused it likewise, would follow him. The message was plain. The succession was no longer a subject for private conscience. It was a matter of state, enforced by law, and the law required that every man in England accept that Catherine's marriage was void and Elizabeth's birth was legitimate. The public ritual of precedence, who walked first, who was seated where at banquets, whose household received which allowances, whose servant wore finer cloth, was recalibrated to reflect the new reality. Mary's household at Ludlow was dissolved. Her title was removed. The Privy Council sent instructions. She was no longer to be called princess. She was the Lady Mary. The girl who had been treated as Princess of Wales in all but formal investiture was now, in the regime's language, merely the king's natural daughter, a euphemism that carried the weight of bastardry without quite pronouncing the word. Her servants were reduced, her allowance was cut. The physical markers of rank that had surrounded her since birth, the quality of her plate, the size of her retinue, the deference of those who served her, were systematically withdrawn. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's household at Hatfield was established with care. The infant was given attendance, a wet nurse, rockers, and the apparatus of a royal nursery. It was into this household that Mary would shortly be absorbed, not as a sister visiting, not as a princess in her own right, but as a lady in waiting to the baby who had replaced her. The arrangement was deliberate and pointed. It placed the older daughter in physical proximity to the younger, forced her to witness the ceremony and privilege she had lost, and reminded her daily that the regime's definition of legitimacy had changed, and that she was now on the wrong side of it. Mary would later tell Chapuis that she was watched, confined, and made to feel the full weight of her new status at every meal, every chapel service, every interaction with the household staff, who had been instructed to call her Lady Mary and to treat the infant Elizabeth as their mistress. The court prepared to rewrite everything around a baby in a cradle, and 17-year-old Mary, who had spent her entire conscious life being told she was the Princess of England, was about to discover what it meant when a father with the power of Parliament and the Church behind him decided that a princess could be unmade. Not by war, not by invasion, not by any force she had been taught to recognize as danger, but by statute, by oath, and by the quiet, relentless machinery of institutional obedience. If this story has you as captivated as I think it has, do subscribe. What happened next to this family is something the public never knew, and we're only just beginning. To understand what Mary lost, you have to understand what she had, and what she had for the first 17 years of her life was not merely a title. It was a world, physical, ceremonial, and emotional, built to tell her every day who she was. The household at Ludlow Castle was the clearest expression of it. Perched on its ridge above the River Tame in the Shropshire borderlands, Ludlow was the seat of the Council of Wales. And when Henry sent Mary there in the autumn of 1525, at 9 years old, he was placing her inside a tradition that had belonged to heirs of the English crown for generations. Arthur had been sent to Ludlow. Edward IV's sons had been associated with the Welsh Council before him. The appointment was not nominal. Mary presided over a household of considerable size, attended by a governess, Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, a woman of royal blood herself, deeply devout, fiercely loyal, and the closest thing Mary had to a second mother. The Countess supervised Mary's education, her religious observance, her deportment, and the domestic rhythms of a household that functioned as a miniature court. There were musicians, chaplains, tutors, ladies in waiting, grooms, and kitchen staff. There were regular dispatches to and from the king. There was ceremony, chapel services, meals taken in state, the daily observance of rank and precedence that made a royal household something more than a domestic arrangement. It was in its way a rehearsal for queenship. And Mary inhabited it with the seriousness of a girl who understood, even at 9, that she was being prepared for something. The education Catherine had designed for her daughter was exceptional by any standard. Mary studied Latin under the guidance of scholars recommended by the Spanish humanist Juan Luis Vives, whose treatise on the education of women had been dedicated to Catherine herself. She read Erasmus, Thomas More's Utopia, Plutarch, and Seneca. She was fluent in French and Spanish, competent in Italian, and trained in music with a skill that contemporaries noted with genuine admiration. She played the virginals with accomplishment and would continue to do so for the rest of her life. Her theological education was deep and orthodox, rooted in the Catholic faith her mother embodied, and it gave her not only piety, but intellectual confidence. Mary was not a passive student. She was curious, sharp, and possessed of a memory that retained what she read. In diplomatic correspondence, she was discussed as a suitable bride for virtually every eligible prince in Europe. The French ambassador described her, at the age of 9, as a child of remarkable self-possession. The Venetian ambassador, a few years later, noted that she was small for her age, but carried herself with a gravity that made her seem older. That gravity was partly temperament and partly training. Catherine's influence was everywhere in Mary's formation. The mother taught the daughter that legitimacy was not merely a legal category, but a spiritual one. That to be born of a valid marriage, blessed by the church, was to occupy a position that no earthly authority could rightly undo. Catherine also taught Mary that a woman could be learned, politically engaged, and publicly formidable without ceasing to be devout. The model Catherine offered was not submission, but dignity under pressure. Mary absorbed that model completely. It would sustain her through years of persecution. It would also, in the end, limit her, because the rigidity that kept Mary upright when everything around her was being dismantled was the same rigidity that would make her reign, decades later, a story of restoration attempted too late and at too high a cost. But none of that belonged to these years. These years were the years of confidence. The diplomatic marriage negotiation reinforced that confidence and made it tangible. In 1518, when Mary was barely 2, she had been betrothed to the Dauphin of France as part of the Treaty of London, a grand piece of European peacemaking that used an infant princess as its centerpiece. At the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520, Mary's existence was part of the spectacle, the living proof of Tudor fertility and Anglo-French amity. The betrothal was later dissolved, as such arrangements often were, but it was replaced by other proposals. Marriage to the Emperor Charles V was discussed seriously in the early 1520s, an alliance that would have made Mary the most powerful woman in Europe. That negotiation, too, collapsed. Charles married Isabella of Portugal instead, but the point is not which marriage was concluded. The point is that Mary, throughout her childhood, was treated as a figure of European consequence. Ambassadors reported on her health, her education, her appearance, and her temperament, because she was, in the eyes of the continental courts, a potential queen consort or even a potential queen regnant, and her value as a diplomatic instrument was inseparable from the legitimacy of her parents' marriage. Every treaty discussion that named her assumed that Catherine was Henry's lawful wife and Mary was Henry's lawful daughter. When that assumption was later destroyed, the diplomatic architecture built on it collapsed as well. For Elizabeth, the best years were briefer and more fragile. They lasted from her birth in September 1533 to the spring of 1536, barely 2.5 years, during which she was, in the eyes of the law, the heir presumptive to the English throne. Her household at Hatfield was established with the seriousness befitting that status. She was attended by Lady Margaret Bryan, a capable and experienced governess who had also cared for Mary in her infancy, and by a retinue of servants whose size and quality reflected the regime's investment in the new succession. Elizabeth was dressed in silks and velvets. She was carried in procession. Ambassadors noted her presence and her health, and visited when she could, and the dispatches suggest genuine maternal warmth. Anne playing with her daughter, holding her up for courtiers to admire, anxious about the child's welfare when separated from her. The Hatfield household, for those months, functioned as the nursery of the future. Elizabeth was the daughter of the current queen, the child whose existence justified the break with Rome, and the living proof that the new marriage was fertile and blessed. But the proof was incomplete. Elizabeth was a daughter, and in the arithmetic of Tudor succession, a daughter, even the right daughter, even the daughter of the reigning queen, was only a placeholder until a son arrived. Anne knew this with the particular clarity of a woman whose entire position depended on it. Henry knew it with the impatience of a man who had upended a nation to get what he wanted and had not yet received it. The court, watching Anne's subsequent pregnancies with the same anxious attention it had once given Catherine's, knew it with the weary familiarity of people who had seen this pattern before. Anne miscarried in the summer of 1534. She may have miscarried again in 1535, though the evidence is uncertain, and the court was careful about what it allowed to be recorded. By the beginning of 1536, the trajectory was beginning to look horribly familiar. A queen who could not produce a living son was a queen whose foundation was eroding beneath her, regardless of the constitutional revolution that had been undertaken on her behalf. The best years of Elizabeth's infancy were shadowed from the start by the same biological anxiety that had destroyed Catherine's marriage. The only difference was the speed. What had taken Catherine nearly 2 decades of hope and loss would take Anne barely 3 years. The social world surrounding both daughters during these years should be understood not as background, but as the medium through which power, status, and danger were all physically felt. The Tudor court was not simply a place where the king lived. It was a machine for the display and enforcement of hierarchy, and every person who moved through it understood that their position within its rituals was a daily verdict on their standing. Greenwich Palace, where both Mary and Elizabeth were born, was Henry's preferred residence. Sprawling along the south bank of the Thames, its great hall and tilt yard the settings for tournaments, banquets, and the elaborate pageantry that Henry used to project authority and magnificence to foreign ambassadors and his own nobility alike. Hampton Court, which Henry had seized from the disgraced Wolsey and expanded into the largest palace in England, was a monument to dynastic ambition. Its kitchens capable of feeding a court of over 1,000 people, its chapel ceiling studded with gold stars, its astronomical clock announcing the time, the phase of the moon, and the hour of high water at London Bridge. Richmond, Whitehall, Windsor, Eltham. The court rotated between residences according to the season, and at each one the rituals of precedence were performed with obsessive attention. Who dined with the king? Who was permitted into the privy chamber? Who walked closest to the queen in procession? Whose children were placed in the nursery of the heir? These were not trivial social niceties. They were the visible grammar of power. And when that grammar changed, and when a daughter who had once been carried at the front of a procession was suddenly removed from it, the change was legible to everyone who witnessed it, from the highest lord to the lowest groom of the household. It was inside this world of performed status that the first signs of Mary's coming destruction appeared. They came not as a single dramatic rupture, but as a series of shifts in atmosphere, each one small enough to be denied and cumulatively impossible to ignore. Henry's pursuit of Anne Boleyn, which had been an open secret at court since the late 1520s, began to alter the emotional geography of the royal household well before any statute was passed. Catherine's position became strained not by law, but by proximity, by the presence of a younger woman whose ambition and whose hold on the king made the old queen's dignity increasingly difficult to maintain. By 1531, Henry and Catherine were no longer living together. The separation was not announced, it simply happened. Catherine was removed from the court and sent to the Moor, a bishop's residence in Hertfordshire, and Henry did not say goodbye. The silence was itself a statement. Catherine's household continued, her ladies attended her, her chaplain said mass, But the king was no longer present, and everyone understood what his absence meant. Mary, at 14 and 15, watched this happen from a distance that was itself a form of punishment. She had seen her mother's household shrink. She had noticed the courtiers, who had once been attentive, beginning to recalibrate their loyalties to the shifting wind. She had seen her father's visits become less frequent, his manner when he did come cooler, his interest in her education and her marriage prospects less pressing. The girl who had been the subject of treaty negotiations and ambassadorial reports was beginning to disappear from the diplomatic correspondence, not because she had changed, but because the regime was changing around her. Mary's position was becoming conditional, not yet formally challenged, but no longer assumed. The private family was fracturing. The public law had not yet caught up with it. Catherine's refusal to cooperate with Henry's annulment proceedings was the wound that could not be hidden. In the summer of 1529, the Legatine Court convened at Blackfriars in London to hear Henry's case. Catherine appeared, knelt before the king, and delivered an appeal that would become one of the most famous moments in Tudor history. She spoke in her accented English. She had lived in England for nearly 30 years, but never fully lost the Spanish inflection, and she asked for justice. She declared that she had come to Henry a virgin, that their marriage was valid before God and the Church, and that she would accept no judgment on her case from an English tribunal. She appealed to Rome. Then she rose, bowed to the king, and walked out of the court. The usher called her back. She did not turn. She was summoned a second time, a third. She kept walking. The hall was silent except for her footsteps and the murmur of men who had just watched the queen refuse to be judged. The defiance was extraordinary. It was also for Mary, a lesson that went deeper than any politics. Catherine had shown that a woman could stand before the machinery of the state and refuse to participate in her own destruction. She had shown that dignity could be an act of resistance. Mary would carry that example for the rest of her life, and she would carry its cause because Catherine's refusal, magnificent as it was, did not halt the machinery. It merely redirected it. When the Legatine Court failed to deliver the verdict Henry wanted, Cardinal Campeggio adjourned proceedings and referred the case back to Rome. Wolsey's downfall was swift. He was stripped of his offices in October 1529 and died the following November on his way to London to face charges of treason. Cromwell, who had served as Wolsey's secretary and had learned from him the art of managing parliament and manipulating legal instruments, stepped into the vacuum. The project of annulment shifted from ecclesiastical diplomacy to legislative action, and by 1532 the shape of the coming catastrophe was visible to anyone who cared to see it. Henry and Anne were appearing together at court. Catherine had been banished from the royal presence. Cranmer had been identified as the archbishop who would deliver the ecclesiastical verdict the king required. The submission of the clergy had been extracted. Thomas More had resigned the Lord Chancellorship rather than endorse what was coming. The Act of Supremacy was being drafted. Mary's position, princess, heir, daughter of a valid marriage, was about to be redefined by the force of statute, and there was no institution in England with either the authority or the will to prevent it. The fracture, when it came in full, arrived not as a single blow, but as a sequence of interlocking legal and domestic acts carried out across 1533 and 1534 with the methodical precision that was Cromwell's signature. In January 1533, Henry married Anne Boleyn in a secret ceremony. Catherine was still legally his wife, but the regime had decided to act as if the old marriage no longer existed and let the law catch up. In May, Cranmer convened an ecclesiastical court at Dunstable and declared Catherine's marriage void. In June, Anne was crowned queen at Westminster Abbey with a coronation of deliberate magnificence. The streets lined with pageantry, the river alive with barges, the message unmistakable. This was the queen now, and the old order was finished. In September, Elizabeth was born. In March 1534, the first act of succession passed through Parliament, declaring Elizabeth the legitimate heir and Mary illegitimate. The act did not merely alter the line of succession. It required an oath. Every subject of the crown was to swear that the king's marriage to Catherine had been unlawful, that his marriage to Anne was valid, and that Elizabeth was the rightful heir. Refusal was treason. The oath swept through the realm like a loyalty test. Bishops, abbots, members of parliament, municipal officers, and eventually the members of Mary's own household were required to swear. The effect on Mary was devastating and immediate. Her title was formally removed. She was no longer to be addressed as princess. Her household at Ludlow was dissolved. Margaret Pole, the countess who had been her governess and surrogate mother, was dismissed. Mary's world did not collapse overnight. It was disassembled piece by piece by people carrying instructions. The scene at Hatfield in December 1533 deserves to be rendered with the full weight of its cruelty. Mary, now 17, was transferred to the household of the infant Elizabeth. She was not consulted, she was not given a choice. A commission arrived, and men of the Privy Council, carrying written instructions, to inform her that she was no longer princess, that she would reside in the household of the Princess Elizabeth at Hatfield House in Hertfordshire, and that she would be expected to show the infant the deference that rank demanded. The house itself was a substantial brick manor in the gently rolling countryside north of London, set among gardens and parkland, comfortable enough by the standards of a gentry household, but nothing like the establishments Mary had known. Her rooms were smaller. Her attendants were fewer. The household she entered was organized entirely around the baby. Its rhythms, its nurses, its governess, its schedule of feeding and sleeping and being carried in procession through the grounds when visitors came. Mary existed inside that household as an anomaly, the older daughter of the king, stripped of her title, surrounded by people who had been instructed to treat her as subordinate to a child who could not yet walk. Mary's response, reported by Chapuis from intelligence gathered through his network of sympathizers, was that she knew of no princess of England other than herself. The defiance was precise, measured, and deliberate, the kind of resistance that came from Catherine's training, from years of watching her mother refuse to bend. It was also from that moment onward punishable. The Sheltons, who ran the Hatfield household under Anne's authority, were given clear instructions to enforce the new order with consistency and without exceptions. Mary was denied her own dining arrangements. She was expected to take her meals with the household, seated below the officers of the infant's establishment. She was made to walk behind Elizabeth's litter when the household traveled between residences. Her correspondence was monitored, letters intercepted, messages read, contacts noted. Her visitors were restricted to those the regime deemed safe, which meant almost no one. When Anne Boleyn visited Hatfield in the spring of 1534, she sent a message through the Sheltons inviting Mary to come and pay her respects to the Queen. Anne was, by this point, heavily invested in Mary's submission, not only because Mary's defiance was a personal affront, but because it undermined the legitimacy of the settlement on which Anne's own position rested. Mary's reply, relayed through a household servant, was that she knew of no queen in England other than her mother, and that if the Lady Anne, the king's mistress, wished to intercede with the king on Mary's behalf, Mary would be grateful for the kindness. The message was calculated to wound. It denied Anne every title she claimed. It reduced her from queen to mistress, and it reached Anne at Hatfield itself, in a household Anne controlled, delivered by people who answered to Anne's authority. Anne's fury was immediate and visible. She reportedly told the Sheltons to box Mary's ears, to treat her as the disobedient girl the regime said she was. Whether the order was carried out is uncertain. What is not uncertain is the atmosphere it created, a household in which a teenage girl's daily existence was governed by people who had been told by the Queen herself that her resistance was intolerable. This is where the outline's core distinction between the two sisters must be understood. Mary was old enough to resist, and therefore old enough to be punished for resisting. She had language, memory, conviction, and the example of her mother. She could say no, and she did, and the regime responded with escalating pressure because her refusal was articulate and visible and dangerous. Elizabeth, by contrast, was too young to contest anything. She was an infant, then a toddler, then a small child, present in the household, carried in processions, dressed in the silks the regime provided, entirely unaware of the political meaning attached to her existence. Her first fracture was not something she experienced as defiance or submission. It was something done around her and over her, a rearrangement of the adult world that she absorbed without comprehension. That difference matters profoundly because it explains the different emotional textures of their adulthood. Mary would remember argument, confrontation, and the specific words she had used in specific rooms to specific people. Elizabeth would remember atmosphere, the sudden changes in a household's mood, the appearance and disappearance of faces, the inexplicable shifts in how she was treated, the lesson that safety was never permanent and that the people around you could be rearranged at any moment by forces you could not see. The humiliation was not incidental to the regime's strategy. It was the strategy. Cromwell understood that Mary's resistance, if left unchecked, could become a rallying point for everyone who opposed the new settlement. The old Catholic nobility, the supporters of Catherine's cause, the men and women across the country who still regarded Mary as their rightful princess, and the act of succession as an act of tyranny. As long as Mary refused to accept the new order, she was dangerous, not because she had an army, but because she had a claim, and the claim resonated. The daily grind of her demotion, the forms of address, the placement at meals, the reduction of her attendance, the monitoring of her letters, the denial of her physician when she fell ill, was designed not merely to punish but to break, to exhaust the resistance out of her, to make compliance seem like the only way to survive. And the breaking was witnessed. Such Chapuis's dispatches from these months are filled with details that make the cruelty legible across the centuries. Mary ill with headaches and stomach complaints that worsened under stress. Mary refusing to eat at the common table because sitting there meant accepting a place below the infant's household officers. Mary shut in her room for days at a time with pains she could not explain. Mary sending secret messages to her mother through sympathetic servants who risked their own positions to carry them. Catherine sent back replies urging her daughter to hold fast but also to be careful, to preserve her health, to bend where conscience permitted and to resist only where it did not. The mother and daughter were negotiating the impossible: how to maintain integrity inside a system that had been specifically designed to make integrity indistinguishable from treason. Catherine herself, by this point, was enduring her own version of the same persecution, conducted at a greater distance from the court but with the same relentless administrative precision. She had been moved from the relative comfort of the moor in Hertfordshire to Buckton in Huntingdonshire, a drafty, damp residence that she hated, and then, in the spring of 1534, to Kimbolton Castle in Cambridgeshire, a medieval fortification surrounded by flat fenland, cold in winter, isolated in every season. Each move took her further from London, further from the court, further from any place where her presence might serve as a visible reproach to the regime. Her household was reduced at every stage. Servants who showed too much loyalty were dismissed. Her Spanish ladies were monitored. Her chaplains were watched. She was forbidden to use the title of queen and required to accept the title of Dowager Princess of Wales. The widow of Prince Arthur, not the wife of King Henry. She refused. The letters she sent to the king, to Cromwell, to Chapuis were signed Catherine the Queen. The letters that came back, when they came at all, were addressed to the Princess Dowager. She was forbidden above all to see Mary. That prohibition was enforced with particular strictness because the regime understood that a meeting between the mother and daughter, both of them defiant, both of them refusing the new titles, both of them representing the legitimacy the state had declared void with the Statute d'Oui, would be a political event, a visible symbol of the resistance the government was trying to extinguish. Catherine and Mary communicated through intermediaries, sympathetic servants who carried messages at personal risk, Chapuis agents who relayed intelligence between the households, and occasionally letters that were smuggled past the officials assigned to prevent them. The correspondence that survives, fragments, reported speech, Chapuis paraphrases, reveals a mother urging her daughter to hold fast to conscience, but also to be careful, to preserve her health, to bend on matters of form, where bending did not touch the essential question. Catherine was not reckless. She understood that Mary's life might be at risk. She also understood that to yield on the central point, to the validity of the marriage, the legitimacy of the daughter, was to destroy the only thing that neither the king nor parliament could take from them by force. The parallel between mother and daughter during these years is one of the story's most powerful emotional structures. Two women, separated by the state, sustaining the same resistance through letters they were not supposed to send, connected by a conviction they were not permitted to express, each drawing courage from the knowledge that the other had not broken. Catherine's health was declining. She suffered from recurring pain, from what may have been a tumor or an infection that worsened in the cold, damp conditions at Kimbolton. She was 50 years old and looked older. She would be dead within 2 years. And yet she did not yield. That refusal, sustained from a drafty castle in the Cambridgeshire fens by a woman with a shrinking household and a failing body, is one of the most remarkable acts of resistance in the entire Tudor period. Mary knew it. She drew on it. She would carry her mother's example forward into the years that followed, long after Catherine was gone, and the example was all that remained. The consequences of the first fracture spread outward from Mary and Catherine into the wider court and country. Thomas More was arrested in April 1534 for refusing the oath and would be executed in July 1535. Bishop John Fisher was arrested the same month and executed 2 weeks before More. The Carthusian monks of the London Charterhouse, who also refused, were executed in a series of hideous public spectacles, hanged, drawn, and quartered, that served as a warning to anyone who thought the oath was optional. The message was not lost on Mary. The same mechanism that had killed More and Fisher, the conversion of a king's domestic will into a law backed by the death penalty, was the mechanism that now defined her own existence. She was illegitimate by statute. She was a subject who owed obedience to the act of succession, and every day she continued to call herself princess. She was, in the strictest legal sense, defying an act of parliament, and yet Anne had not solved the problem that had justified all of this destruction. By the end of 1534, the regime had broken Catherine's household, dismantled Mary's status, executed some of the most respected men in England, and restructured the relationship between the English crown and the Church of Rome, all in the service of a succession that was supposed to end with a son. Anne had not delivered that son. Elizabeth was healthy, growing, and declared the heir, but Elizabeth was a daughter, and the dynasty that had destroyed one daughter's legitimacy in pursuit of a male heir had so far produced only a second daughter in her place. The engine of destruction was running. The justification for it remained incomplete, and somewhere in a household she did not choose, watched by people she had not appointed, forbidden to write to the mother she was not allowed to see, Mary was still refusing to call herself anything other than what she had been born. The years between 1534 and the beginning of 1536 are the years in which the story slows to the pace of endurance. Nothing was resolved, everything was sustained. The pressure on Mary, the isolation of Catherine, Anne's increasingly fragile position, the regime's demand for compliance, and the absence of the son, whose arrival was supposed to have justified everything. The court continued its rituals. Parliament continued to legislate. Cromwell continued to manage the machinery of enforcement. And the two daughters of Henry VIII continued to exist inside a settlement that treated them as problems to be administered rather than children to be raised. For Mary, these were the years of slow grinding. Her daily existence at Hatfield had settled into a pattern that was oppressive precisely because it was ordinary. She rose, she dressed in clothes that were adequate but no longer fine. She attended chapel in a household that observed the new religious forms she rejected. She ate meals at a table where her placement told her, each day, that she was subordinate to the infant Elizabeth's officers. She read, she played music, she corresponded, when she could, with Chapuis's intermediaries and with the diminishing circle of people who still dared to show her sympathy. And she was ill, not continuously but recurrently, in a pattern that Chapuis documented with anxious regularity. She suffered from recurring headaches, from pains in her stomach and chest that came and went without clear cause, from episodes of what may have been depression, or what the 16th century understood as melancholia, a heaviness of spirit that manifested in sleeplessness, loss of appetite, and a withdrawal into her rooms that the household interpreted as stubbornness, and that was more likely the body's protest against conditions it could no longer absorb. She was 18, then 19, living under surveillance in a household organized around a toddler, forbidden to see her mother, denied adequate medical attention when she was ill, and required to navigate each day inside a system designed to remind her of what she had lost. Her physicians, when they were eventually permitted to attend her, reported that her condition worsened when she was upset and improved when she received kindness, a diagnosis that says more about the cruelty of the environment than about the nature of the illness. Mary's resistance, though, did not soften. She continued to refuse the title of Lady Mary. She continued to assert to anyone who would listen and to some who would not that she was the princess and that her mother was the queen. She did this knowing what it cost. In the spring of 1535, there were rumors, reported by Chapuis with alarm, that Cromwell had discussed the possibility of prosecuting Mary for treason. The legal basis existed. She was defying the act of succession, and defiance of that act had already sent Thomas More and John Fisher to their deaths. Whether Henry would have executed his own daughter is a question the sources do not answer definitively, and historians have debated the point without consensus. What is not debatable is that the threat existed, that Mary knew it existed, and that she continued to defy the act anyway. Her stubbornness was not merely a family irritant. It was a political problem with a political solution, and the political solution, if the regime chose to pursue it, was the scaffold. That Mary was aware of this, that she went to sleep each night in a household that might, on any morning, receive instructions to send her to the Tower. is part of what makes her resistance so remarkable and so costly to her health. The first of the two great losses that would define the next phase of the story came on the 7th of January 1536. Catherine of Aragon died at Kimbleton Castle. She was 50 years old. She had been ill for months. A worsening condition that may have been cancer or a cardiac tumor or an infection that the damp conditions at Kimbleton had aggravated beyond recovery. In her final days, she was attended by a small household that had been reduced over the years to a handful of loyal servants and her Spanish ladies. She dictated a letter to Henry, a last letter written when she knew she was dying, in which she called him my most dear Lord, King, and husband, and asked him to be a good father to Mary. She asked for nothing for herself. She signed it Catherine the Queen. She had never used any other title, and she did not abandon it in death. The letter is one of the most affecting documents of the Tudor period. It is brief, controlled, and devastating in its restraint. Catherine did not accuse. She did not plead. She did not rage against the treatment she had endured. She simply stated one last time what she had always stated, and that she was Henry's wife, that their daughter was legitimate, and that she forgave him. Whether Henry read it with feeling or with irritation is debated. What is documented is his response to the news of her death. He dressed in yellow, held a celebration at court, and carried Elizabeth in his arms. A display that was interpreted variously as joy, relief, or a calculated performance of political liberation. Catherine was buried at Peterborough Cathedral on the 29th of January, with the honors due not to a queen but to a Dowager Princess of Wales. The distinction was maintained even in death. The regime would not concede, even over a coffin, that Catherine had been what she said she was. Mary was not permitted to attend the funeral. She learned of her mother's death at Hatfield through channels that are not precisely documented, possibly through Chapuis's network, possibly through a household servant who carried the news. The grief was private and immense. Catherine had been the person for whom Mary had been resisting. The mother's conviction had sustained the daughter's defiance. Now Catherine was gone, and Mary was left with the resistance, but without the living presence that had given it meaning. Chapuis reported that Mary was devastated, ill again, confined to her rooms, unable to eat. He also reported something more complicated, that Mary, in the days after Catherine's death, began for the first time to consider whether continued defiance was sustainable. The anchor had been pulled. The question of whether to keep holding had become a different question. Anne Boleyn's position during these same months was eroding in ways that mirrored, with terrible symmetry, the erosion Catherine had experienced before her. Anne had staked everything on the promise of a son. She had delivered a daughter. Her subsequent pregnancies had failed. Miscarriages in 1534 and possibly 1535, and then in January 1536, a devastating loss. Anne miscarried a male fetus, reportedly at approximately 3.5 months of gestation. The miscarriage occurred on the 29th of January, the same day Catherine of Aragon was buried at Peterborough Cathedral. Whether the timing was coincidence, or whether the stress of the preceding days had contributed, Anne had reportedly been shaken by reports that Henry had been thrown from his horse during a joust at Greenwich on the 24th of January, remaining unconscious for 2 hours, and she had feared he might die. The political consequence was identical. The son was gone. Anne's leverage was gone with it. Henry, who had upended a nation to marry her, was already looking elsewhere. Jane Seymour, quiet, fair-haired, demure in a manner that Anne had never been and never tried to be, had begun to attract the king's attention. The faction at court that had always opposed the Boleyn ascendancy, men like Sir Nicholas Carew, the Marquis of Exeter, and others who had sympathized with Catherine's cause, were encouraging that interest with calculated enthusiasm, coaching Jane in how to refuse the king's advances in a way that would inflame rather than extinguish his desire. The strategy was Anne's own, turned against her. Anne had withheld herself to win a crown. Jane was being taught to withhold herself to replace her. The collapse, when it came, was swift in execution and merciless in design. In late April 1536, Cromwell began assembling a case against Anne. The charges were adultery with 5 men: the court musician Mark Smeaton, the courtiers Sir Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, and William Brereton, and Anne's own brother George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, and of conspiring the king's death. The evidence was extracted under interrogation, much of it from Smeaton, who was the only one of the accused to confess and who may have been tortured or threatened with torture to produce his testimony. The historical consensus, then and now, is that the charges were fabricated or grotesquely exaggerated, That Cromwell constructed the case not because he believed Anne was guilty, but because the king wanted to be free of her, and Cromwell understood that a queen could not simply be divorced a second time. The destruction had to be total. It had to remove Anne not just from the marriage, but from the world. The men were arrested first. Then, on the 2nd of May, Anne herself was taken. She was escorted to the Tower of London by river, entering through the court gate, the same entrance she had passed through in triumph on her way to the coronation 3 years earlier. The Tower's constable, Sir William Kingston, later reported that Anne asked him whether she would be placed in a dungeon. He told her she would be lodged in the same apartments she had occupied before her coronation. Anne laughed, like a strange involuntary sound that Kingston noted with discomfort, and that suggests a woman whose composure was beginning to fracture under the strain of understanding what was happening to her. The trial took place on the 15th of May in the Great Hall of the Tower, before a jury of 26 peers presided over by Anne's own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. The proceedings were a formality dressed in the language of justice. Anne denied every charge. She defended herself with a clarity and a composure that several observers noted with admiration. It made no difference. The verdict was unanimous. She was found guilty of treason and sentenced to be burned or beheaded at the king's pleasure. Henry chose the sword. A specialist swordsman was sent for from Saint-Omer in Calais, a detail that historians have noted as evidence that the execution had been arranged before the trial concluded. On the morning of the 19th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed on Tower Green, within the walls of the fortress rather than on the public scaffold at Tower Hill. The crowd was small and selected, no more than a few dozen witnesses, mostly officials and foreign observers. Anne wore a gray damask gown trimmed with fur and an ermine mantle. Her dark hair was tucked beneath a gable hood. She addressed the witnesses with composure, following the convention of the scaffold, praising the king's justice, asking for prayers, saying nothing that could be used against those she left behind. The swordsman was standing behind her. She did not see the blade. The stroke was clean. She was dead before her body reached the ground. She was 35 years old, or possibly 29. The age, like so much about Anne Boleyn, remains disputed among historians, who have argued the question for centuries without resolution. Her body was placed in an arrow chest and buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower precincts. There was no funeral. There was no monument. The queen who had reshaped the English church was gone, and the court moved on with the speed of people who understood that mourning the wrong person was dangerous. For the two daughters, Anne's fall produced consequences that were immediate, asymmetrical, and devastating in different registers. For Mary, who had spent 3 years resisting everything Anne's queenship represented, the news might have seemed like vindication. The woman who had displaced her mother was gone, destroyed by the same king who had elevated her. And there was, in the first days after the execution, a flicker of hope. Chapuis reported that Mary believed her father might now restore her to favor, that with Anne removed and Catherine already dead, the obstacle to reconciliation had been cleared. That hope lasted days. It was extinguished by the realization that Henry had no intention of going back. Anne's fall did not restore the old order. It merely removed one version of the new order and replaced it with another. Henry did not return to Catherine's daughter. He moved forward to Jane Seymour's promise. For the two daughters, Anne's fall produced consequences that were immediate, asymmetrical, and devastating in different registers. For Mary, the news might have seemed at first like vindication. The woman who had displaced her mother was gone, destroyed by the same king who had elevated her. Chapuis reported that Mary believed in the days after the execution that her father might now restore her to favor. With Anne removed and Catherine already dead, the obstacle to reconciliation appeared to have been cleared. That hope lasted days. It was extinguished by the realization that Henry had no intention of going backward. Anne's fall did not restore the old order. It merely removed one version of the new order and replaced it with another. Henry did not return to Catherine's daughter. He moved forward to Jane Seymour's promise. The legislative instrument that formalized this reality was the Second Act of Succession, which passed through Parliament in July 1536. The act declared Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn void. Cranmer had already annulled it on the 17th of May, 2 days before the execution, on grounds that remain obscure but may have involved a pre-contract between Anne and Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, and it declared Elizabeth illegitimate. The act also confirmed what the First Act of Succession had already established about Catherine's marriage, that Mary was illegitimate too. The effect was symmetrical and unprecedented. Both of Henry's surviving daughters were now in-law bastards. Neither had a place in the succession. The crown was to pass to the children of Henry's marriage to Jane Seymour, children who did not yet exist, or failing that, to whomever the king might designate, by letters patent, or by his last will and testament. There is something about that legislative moment that is worth sitting with. Henry had broken with Rome, restructured the English church, executed his closest counselors, destroyed two queens, and upended the succession twice. And the result, as of the summer of 1536, was a kingdom with no legitimate heir at all. The son had not arrived. The two daughters who existed had both been declared illegitimate by the same parliament that had once declared each of them, in turn, the rightful successor to the crown. The dynasty that had begun with a battlefield victory and a permanent anxiety about disputed succession had, through the actions of its own king, produced the very crisis it had spent 50 years trying to prevent. That irony was not lost on the ambassadors who reported it to their courts, or on the courtiers who lived inside it, or on the two girls, one a young woman of 20, the other a child not yet 3, who bore its weight in their bodies in their daily lives. For Elizabeth, the consequences were of a different kind entirely. Less articulate, more atmospheric, and in some ways more deeply inscribed because they were absorbed by a child too young to defend herself against them. She was 2 years and 8 months old. She had no understanding of what had happened, no framework for processing the information that her mother had been taken away and would not return. What she had was the experience of absence, the sudden disappearance of a presence she had known, the change in the household's atmosphere, the shift in how people spoke around her and about her, the arrival of new instructions about how she was to be addressed and treated. The household at Hatfield did not collapse overnight. Lady Margaret Bryan remained as governess, and the servants who knew the child continued their duties. But the tenor of the place changed. The urgency was gone. The sense that this household contained the future of England was gone. Elizabeth was no longer the reason for the break with Rome. She was the residue of it. For Mary, the second act of succession was the cruelest confirmation imaginable. She had endured 3 years of humiliation, illness, surveillance, and separation from her mother on the unspoken understanding, or at least the private hope, that she was suffering for a principle that would eventually be vindicated. Catherine's marriage was valid. Mary was legitimate. The Boleyn settlement was an injustice, and injustices in the moral universe Catherine had taught her daughter to inhabit were eventually corrected. Anne's fall should have been that correction. It was not. Instead, Parliament confirmed Mary's illegitimacy a second time, not because Catherine's marriage was being re-examined in some new theological light, but because the regime simply did not need Mary to be legitimate. Henry was not going backward. He was not restoring the world Anne had displaced. He was building a third settlement, Jane Seymour's settlement, and in that settlement, neither of the previous queen's daughters had a place. The bitterness of that realization is one of the strongest emotional reversals in the entire story. Mary had suffered for the duration of Anne's queenship and gained nothing from Anne's destruction. The machinery that had been built to erase her had not been dismantled. It had simply been retooled. The court's power map shifted accordingly, with a speed that testified to how thoroughly the Tudor system subordinated personal loyalty to political survival. The Boleyn faction collapsed overnight. George Boleyn was dead. Thomas Boleyn, Anne's father, who had been created Earl of Wiltshire and who had sat on the jury that condemned his own son, retired from court in disgrace, stripped of influence if not of title. The men who had risen with the Boleyns found themselves suddenly exposed. Friendships that had been advantageous under Anne were now liabilities under Jane, and the court recalibrated its alliances with the practiced ruthlessness of people who understood that proximity to royal favor was the only currency that mattered, and that the currency could be devalued without warning. Cromwell, who had orchestrated Anne's fall with the same administrative precision he had once used to orchestrate Catherine's displacement, remained indispensable, the one constant in a regime that consumed its own allies and expected gratitude from the survivors. But even Cromwell was not safe, and he knew it. He had destroyed Anne in part because she had become a threat to his own position, and the skills he had used to remove her could, in the right circumstances, be turned against him. 4 years later, they would be. Jane Seymour's family, the Seymours of Wolf Hall in Wiltshire, began their ascent. Edward Seymour, Jane's ambitious elder brother, A soldier and administrator of considerable ability would accumulate titles and influence at a pace that would eventually carry him to the Protectorate of England during his nephew Edward's minority. Thomas Seymour, the younger brother, charming, reckless, and possessed of an ambition that outstripped his judgment, would later entangle himself with the teenage Elizabeth in a scandal that nearly cost both of them their lives. The Seymour rise was typical of the Tudor pattern. A queen's family rose with her and fell when she fell, and the only question was how far the rise would go and how catastrophic the eventual fall would be. Jane herself was married to Henry on the 30th of May, 1536, just 11 days after Anne's execution. A speed that startled even the court's most seasoned observers and that told the country, in the plainest possible terms, that the king's need for a son had not abated and that the machinery of succession was already being prepared for a third attempt. The wheels of court patronage turned, the factions rearranged, and the two daughters, illegitimate in law and invisible in the new settlement's priorities, were left to wait for whatever the regime decided to do with them next. Mary and Elizabeth, meanwhile, were diverging, not geographically, for they still shared the Hatfield household and still existed in the same domestic space, but psychologically, in ways that would shape the rest of their lives and ultimately the character of their reigns. Mary was 20 years old and her character was set. She was her mother's daughter, proud, pious, stubborn, and incapable of pretending that what had happened to her was acceptable. She processed the damage through resistance, through the assertion of her identity, through the refusal to use the titles the regime assigned her. Her faith was the bedrock. The Catholic Church was the institution that said her parents' marriage was valid, and Mary clung to that validation with an intensity that grew stronger as every other source of validation was stripped away. The church was not merely a spiritual home. It was the last authority that agreed with her about who she was. To yield on the religious question, to accept the king's supremacy over the church, would be to accept the annulment, to accept the illegitimacy, to accept that Catherine had been wrong and that the 20 years of marriage had been, as the regime claimed, an offense against God's law. Mary would not do it. She had watched her mother refuse. She had absorbed the lesson, and she carried it forward with a tenacity that the regime found maddening and that the modern viewer can recognize as both heroic and costly, because the same rigidity that preserved Mary's identity during the years of persecution would later, when she became queen, make her incapable of flexibility, incapable of compromise, and incapable of understanding that the England she would inherit was no longer the England her mother had known. Mary's emotional state after Catherine's death was by all accounts a sustained crisis. She was grieving for a mother she had not been permitted to see in the last years of Catherine's life. She was processing the realization that Anne's fall had not restored her status. She was physically ill, the recurrent symptoms worsening, her appetite failing, her energy depleted. And she was aware, through Chapuis and through her own intelligence, that the regime was preparing to demand her compliance in a form more absolute and more humiliating than anything it had required before. The pressure was closing in from every direction. Cromwell was sending messages. The Privy Council was sending commissioners. Henry himself, according to some accounts, was expressing irritation that Mary had not yet submitted, an irritation that carried, given the recent executions, the force of a threat. Mary was not merely being asked to change her title. She was being asked to repudiate her mother's memory, her own identity, and the religious authority that had sustained her through years of isolation. The demand was not bureaucratic, it was existential. Elizabeth was becoming something different, shaped by forces she could not name and would not understand for years. She was not yet 3 when her mother was killed, and personality at that age is more potential than character. But the conditions in which she was being formed were already producing effects that observers would later recognize. She was growing up in a household where authority was unstable, where the adults around her deferred to instructions that changed without warning, where her own title and status had shifted twice before she could speak in full sentences. She was learning, not consciously, not deliberately, but in the deep way that children learn the rules of the world they inhabit, that nothing was fixed, that the people who cared for you could be replaced, that the name you were called could change overnight, that safety was conditional, and the conditions could be altered by someone you had never met, issuing instructions from a palace you had never visited. Lady Bryant's letter to Cromwell, written in the weeks after Anne's execution, is the document that brings Elizabeth's situation into sharpest focus. Bryant was not a political figure. She was a practical woman responsible for a small child's daily care, and her letter reads like what it was, a request for guidance from a governess who had been left without instructions. Elizabeth needed new clothes, Brian wrote. She had outgrown her gowns. She needed caps and kirtles and undergarments appropriate to her station. But what was her station? Nobody had told Brian. Was the child still a princess? Was she now merely the Lady Elizabeth? Should she eat at the household table, and if so, at what place? Should she be dressed in silks or in plainer fabrics? The letter is devastating not because it describes atrocity, but because it describes the absence of information. A child suspended between identities, her governess unable to dress her because no one had clarified what she was. The frock question was a succession question in miniature, and nobody had answered it. Those lessons, the instability, the uncertainty, the sense that identity was something bestowed and revoked by distant authority, would take decades to manifest fully in Elizabeth's character, but they were being laid down in these years, in these rooms, in the particular quality of insecurity that defined her earliest experience of the world. Elizabeth would grow into a woman of extraordinary caution, of elaborate self-presentation, of a watchfulness that her courtiers found both impressive and exhausting. She would delay decisions, hedge commitments, and refuse to declare herself on questions where declaration was dangerous. She would become the most famous practitioner of ambiguity in English political history. And the roots of that ambiguity were here, in a household where a toddler learned that the world changed without warning and that the safest response was to watch, to wait, and to say nothing until you understood which way the wind was blowing. The summer of 1536 was approaching. Catherine was dead, buried at Peterborough under a title she had never accepted. Anne was dead, buried in the Tower under no monument at all. Both daughters were illegitimate by Act of Parliament. Jane Seymour was queen, mild and compliant, carrying the hopes of a regime that had twice destroyed a queen and twice erased a daughter in pursuit of the son who had not yet come. Cromwell was managing the settlement with his customary precision, drafting the articles of submission that would be presented to Mary, anticipating her resistance, preparing for the possibility that the king's patience might finally run out. And the regime, having twice rewritten the succession and twice destroyed a queen to do it, was preparing to do something quieter and in some ways more terrible than anything it had done before. It was preparing to make Mary sign, to take the daughter who had resisted longer and more visibly than anyone else in England, and bring her at last to the document in the submission, the oath, the sheet of state language that would ask her to declare her parents' marriage unlawful, to acknowledge her own illegitimacy, and to recognize her father as supreme head of the Church of England. The cold open was approaching, and Mary, who had endured everything the regime could do to her short of execution, was about to face the one demand she had spent her entire adult life refusing to meet. Cromwell moved first. In the weeks after Anne's execution, while the court was still adjusting to Jane Seymour's quiet presence and the new configuration of power, he turned his attention to the problem that had outlasted 2 queens and 2 acts of succession: Mary's refusal to submit. The political logic was straightforward. Henry wanted a clean settlement. Jane was expected to produce a son. The succession needed to be orderly, and Mary, by continuing to call herself princess and refusing to acknowledge her father's supremacy over the church, was a standing reproach to every statute Parliament had passed since 1533. She was also, as Cromwell understood, with the cold clarity of an administrator who had already sent better men to the scaffold, a potential rallying point for rebellion. The Pilgrimage of Grace, the great northern uprising that would erupt in October 1536, was already gathering its energies in the discontent of a country that had watched monasteries dissolved, saints' shrines demolished, and a queen judicially murdered. Mary's name was invoked by people who wanted the old world back. That made her dangerous in a way that went beyond family stubbornness. It made her a threat to the regime itself. Cromwell's approach was characteristically methodical. He did not send soldiers. He sent commissioners, members of the Privy Council, men of authority and legal standing carrying documents. They arrived at Hatfield in June 1536 with a set of articles that Mary was required to sign. The articles were not vague. They were specific, comprehensive, and designed to close every loophole through which Mary might have maintained a private reservation while appearing to comply. She was to acknowledge that her father was supreme head of the Church of England, renouncing the authority of the Bishop of Rome. She was to acknowledge that her parents' marriage had been unlawful, by God's law and man's law incestuous and unlawful, and to accept the nullification pronounced by Archbishop Cranmer. And she was to acknowledge, in her own hand, that she was illegitimate. The first visit failed. Mary refused. She refused, according to Chapuis, with a determination that alarmed the commissioners and infuriated her father. She would not sign. She would not accept the articles. She told him that she recognized no spiritual authority other than the Pope and no earthly authority that could declare her mother's marriage void. The commissioners withdrew and reported to Cromwell. Cromwell reported to the king. Henry's response was ferocious. There were threats, specific, documented, and terrifying in their implications. Members of the Privy Council told Chapuis that the king was so enraged by Mary's continued defiance that he spoke of having her tried and executed for treason. Whether Henry meant it literally or whether the threats were calculated pressure is a question historians have argued without resolution. But the threats were real enough to reach Mary through the network of intermediaries who had been her lifeline throughout the years of persecution. Chapuis, who had spent years encouraging Mary's resistance, now changed his advice. He told her through trusted channels that she should submit, that conscience could be preserved internally, while outward compliance preserved her life, that a dead princess was of no use to anyone, not to the Catholic cause, not to the emperor, not to herself. The shift in Chapuis' counsel is one of the most telling details in the story. When the most loyal outside voice was saying yield, the situation had become genuinely lethal. The days that followed were, by every account that survives, the worst of Mary's life. She was 20 years old. She was alone, Catherine dead, Anne dead, Chapuis advising surrender, the Privy Council threatening prosecution. Her father's rage reported to her in terms that left no room for misunderstanding. The household at Hatfield, never a place of comfort, became something closer to a prison in atmosphere, if not in name. Mary was watched. Her movements were noted. The commissioners returned, and returned again, pressing the articles, pressing for her signature, pressing with the particular insistence of men who understood that their own positions depended on delivering the result Cromwell and the king demanded. Mary was also ill. The stress had triggered another episode of the symptoms that had plagued her throughout the years at Hatfield: the headaches, the stomach pains, the exhaustion that came with sustained emotional crisis. She was not eating well, she was not sleeping. She was, by Chapuis's account, in a state of mental and physical anguish that those around her recognized as dangerous. The physicians who attended her, when they were permitted to attend, told Cromwell that her health was fragile and that continued pressure might produce a collapse from which she might not recover. Cromwell noted the information and continued pressing. The king's will was the king's will. A daughter's health was a secondary consideration. Chapuis, watching from London, with intelligence gathered through his network of contacts, was by now openly alarmed. He had spent years as Mary's most consistent outside advocate, channeling the emperor's support, relaying messages of encouragement, assuring her that the Catholic powers of Europe stood behind her resistance. Now he reversed course. In a series of communications that reached Mary through intermediaries, Chapuis told her she should submit. His reasoning was blunt and practical. A dead princess served no purpose. The emperor could not intervene militarily. The pope's condemnations carried no enforcement mechanism in England. Henry's rage was real. The threat of prosecution was real. And the example of Moore and Fisher was recent enough to demonstrate that the regime did not bluff. Chapuis advised Mary that she could preserve her conscience internally while making the outward submission the regime demanded, that God would understand a compliance extracted under duress, that the important thing was survival, and that survival required her signature on the articles Cromwell had prepared. The shift in Chapuis' counsel is one of the most telling details in the entire story. When the most loyal voice outside England was saying yield, the situation had become genuinely lethal. Mary was not merely being asked to change her behavior. She was being asked to repudiate in writing everything her mother had lived and died for. To say that Catherine's marriage was unlawful was to say that Catherine had been Henry's concubine, not his wife. To say that Mary was illegitimate was to say that she had been born in sin, that the 20 years of marriage her mother had defended to the grave were, as Henry and Cranmer claimed, an offense against divine law. To acknowledge the king's supremacy was to abandon the Pope, the one authority that had consistently upheld Catherine's cause and Mary's legitimacy. Each article in Cromwell's document was a blade aimed at a different part of Mary's identity. Together, they asked her to participate in the destruction of everything she believed about herself, her mother, and her God. There is something about the days immediately before the submission that carries the quality of a trap closing. Not a dramatic trap, No dungeon, no chains, no midnight arrest, but the bureaucratic trap of a system that had already decided what the outcome would be and was simply waiting for the individual inside it to recognize that the alternative to compliance was death. Mary had held out for 3 years. She had held out through demotion, through household humiliation, through separation from her mother, through Catherine's death, through Anne's execution, through 2 acts of succession that declared her illegitimate, through illness, through isolation, through the knowledge that men of far greater power and influence had been killed for the same defiance she was maintaining. She had held out because Catherine had taught her to hold out, because her faith demanded it, because her identity depended on it, and because yielding felt like a kind of death, even if the scaffold was the other kind. And now every support had been removed. Catherine was gone. The Catholic powers had not rescued her. Chapuis was counseling submission. The Privy Council was threatening prosecution. And her father, the king, the supreme head, the source of all authority in the realm, was making it clear through Cromwell, through the commissioners, and through the reported fury that reached Mary's household like weather, that he would tolerate no further resistance from the daughter he had already decided to erase. Mary signed on the 15th of June, 1536. The exact circumstances of the signing are not fully documented in the way a modern historian would wish. The room is not named, the time of day is not recorded. The precise sequence of events in the final hours before her hand touched the paper is reconstructed from Chapuis' reports and from the document itself, rather than from any eyewitness narrative. What is known is this: Cromwell's commissioners presented the articles. Mary resisted. Cromwell sent further instructions. The pressure intensified, and at some point on that day, in a room at one of the residences where she had been held, likely Hunsdon House in Hertfordshire, where she had been moved from Hatfield, Mary took the pen and signed her name to a set of articles that asked her to deny everything she had spent her adult life defending. The articles were not ambiguous. They were written in the language of legal and theological submission, and they required Mary to acknowledge 3 things. First, that her father, the king, was supreme head of the Church of England, and that the Bishop of Rome and the Pope had no more authority in England than any other foreign bishop. Second, that the marriage between her father and her mother, Catherine of Aragon, had been unlawful, incestuous, and void, and that the judgment of Archbishop Cranmer dissolving it was just and lawful. Third, that she, Mary, born of that void marriage, was illegitimate. Each clause was a separate annihilation. The first destroyed her religious identity. The second destroyed her mother's honor. The third destroyed her own claim to be what she had been born. Together, they constituted the most complete act of self-erasure the regime could devise short of execution. And Mary signed them. Chapuis reported in his dispatch to the emperor that Mary signed without reading the full document, that she put her name to the articles without examining every clause, either because she could not bear to read the words or because she had been advised that signing without full knowledge would preserve a space for her conscience. Whether this account is accurate or whether it is Chapuis' attempt to shield Mary's reputation, to preserve the possibility that the submission was not fully informed and therefore not fully binding, cannot be determined with certainty. What is certain is the effect. Mary's signature was on the document. The document was in Cromwell's hands. The regime had what it wanted. The daughter, who had resisted longer and more publicly than any other figure in England, had at last been made to participate in the destruction of her own identity. The silence after the signing is the hardest part of the story to write, because the sources go quiet precisely where the human reality was most intense. There is no record of what Mary did in the hours after she signed. There is no account of whether she wept, whether she prayed, whether she sat in her room and stared at the wall, whether she spoke to anyone or withdrew into the silence that had been her refuge throughout the years of persecution. What Chapuis reported in the days that followed was that Mary was in a state of profound distress, that she was tormented by what she had done and sought reassurance that the submission, extracted under threat of death, was not binding on her immortal soul. She reportedly asked Chapuis whether the Pope could grant her absolution for what she had signed. She reportedly asked whether God would forgive her for the words she had written about her mother's marriage. The questions reveal the depth of the wound. Mary had not merely signed a legal document. She had, in her own understanding, committed an act of betrayal against Catherine, against the Church, against the truth as she understood it, and against herself. The fact that the betrayal was coerced did not, in Mary's moral framework, make it less real. It simply added the anguish of helplessness to the anguish of complicity. The aftermath of the signing unfolded in two registers. In the political register, the effect was immediate and positive. No, for the regime. Cromwell reported to the king that Mary had submitted. Henry's response was satisfaction, or the appearance of it. The obstacle had been removed. The settlement was clean. Mary was no longer defying the law, no longer a symbol of resistance, no longer a name that discontented Catholics could invoke against the crown. In the days and weeks that followed, there were signs of a thaw that Mary must have found both welcome and unbearable. She was permitted to leave the household at Hunsdon. She was allowed to visit the court. She was given an improved household, better attendance, a more generous allowance, the material comforts that the regime had withdrawn during the years of resistance, now restored as a reward for compliance. Henry received her with a warmth that Chapuis noted with cautious optimism, presenting her with a diamond ring and 1,000 crowns, and speaking to her in the presence of Jane Seymour with something that resembled paternal affection. Jane was kind to Mary, by temperament, by instruction, or by both, and the domestic atmosphere eased in a way that must have felt to a young woman who had spent 3 years in a kind of internal exile, like surfacing from drowning. But in the private register, the damage was permanent. Henry had not unsaid what he had said. He had not declared Catherine's marriage valid. He had not re-legitimized his daughter. He had accepted her compliance and rewarded it with a return to domestic proximity, and the reward was conditional on continued obedience. The submission had purchased survival, comfort, and a measure of paternal favor. It had not purchased truth. It had not purchased justice. And Mary knew this with the particular clarity of a woman who understood exactly what she had signed and exactly what it meant. Chapuis reported that in the weeks after the signing, Mary was tormented, that she sought reassurance about her conscience, that she oscillated between relief at her improved circumstances and horror at the price she had paid for them. She had been broken, not destroyed. She would reassemble herself over years into something formidable and in its own way terrifying, but broken in the specific sense that the person who signed the articles on the 15th of June was not the same person who had refused them a week earlier. Something essential had been surrendered, and it would never be fully reclaimed. The months that followed the submission were a strange interlude, a period in which the Tudor household rearranged itself around Jane Seymour's pregnancy with the same obsessive attention it had once given Catherine's and Anne's. Mary was back at court, or at least in its orbit, a semi-rehabilitated figure whose exact status remained ambiguous. She was the Lady Mary. She was the king's daughter. She was no longer defiant, but she was not the princess, and the submission she had signed was the document that proved it. Her position was comfortable, but conditional. A life built on the understanding that favor could be withdrawn as quickly as it had been restored. Elizabeth, through all of this, remained at Hatfield, a small child in a household that continued to function, staffed by Brian and the servants, but stripped of the political significance it had once carried. She was growing. She was beginning to speak, to read, to absorb the education that would eventually make her one of the most learned women in Europe. But she was growing in a kind of institutional limbo, a king's daughter with no place in the succession, no mother, and a father who showed intermittent interest at best. The contrast with Mary's semi-restoration was itself a lesson. Mary had been punished, had submitted, and had been rewarded with a partial return to favor. Elizabeth had done nothing, was too young to have done anything, and yet remained in the same ambiguous position she had occupied since her mother's death. The regime's attention was elsewhere. It was waiting for a son. The son arrived on the 12th of October, 1537, at Hampton Court Palace, in the Queen's apartments that had been prepared for the event, with the care and anxiety of a dynasty that had waited nearly 3 decades for this moment. Jane Seymour's labor was long and difficult. It lasted 2 days and 3 nights, by the accounts that surviving, but the outcome was the one Henry had reshaped the English church, the English state, and his own family to achieve: a boy, alive, healthy. The kingdom's response was immediate and rapturous. Bonfires were lit in every parish in London. Church bells rang from morning until the evening light failed. Te Deums were sung in the great cathedrals and in the smallest village churches. The Tower of London fired 2,000 rounds of ordnance. Ambassadors sent dispatches of congratulation to courts across Europe. Henry, who had spent nearly 30 years pursuing the son who would secure the Tudor succession, who had broken with Rome, executed his counselors, destroyed 2 queens, bastardized two daughters, and remade the religious and constitutional foundations of the English state in pursuit of this single biological fact, had at last received what he wanted. The boy was named Edward. He was the future. Everything that had happened before his birth was, in the logic of the dynasty, justified by it. The christening, held on the 15th of October in the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court, is one of the scenes the documentary must render in full because it makes the daughter's subordination visible in ritual form. The ceremony was designed to project magnificence and certainty. The court's finest tapestries hung in the corridors through which the procession passed, the chapel ablaze with candles, the font brought from Canterbury for the occasion, the nobility of England assembled in their finest clothes to witness the baptism of the heir. Mary, now 21, served as Edward's godmother. She stood at the font, held the infant, and performed the role that the court assigned her, the elder sister honoring the brother who had displaced her, the bastardized daughter legitimizing by her presence the son whose birth confirmed her exclusion. Elizabeth, 4 years old and too small to walk the length of the procession unaided, was carried by Edward Seymour, the new queen's brother. She bore the chrisom, the baptismal cloth, heavy with symbolic weight, a role that placed her in the ceremony as a participant, but also as an attendant, a supporting figure in a ritual that celebrated the child who made her own claim to the succession irrelevant. The two daughters Henry had tried to erase were made, by the choreography of the christening, to orbit the son who justified their erasure. Mary carried the baby, Elizabeth carried the cloth. The court watched, the ambassadors reported it, and the meaning was legible to everyone present. The daughter served, the son was served, and the hierarchy of the Tudor succession was performed in silk, candlelight, and holy water. Jane Seymour did not survive to see her son grow. She fell ill within days of the birth, puerperal fever. Almost certainly, though the physicians of the day debated the cause and the court was careful about what it committed to paper, her condition deteriorated rapidly. By the 20th of October, she was gravely ill, attended by physicians who could do nothing more than the medicine of the age permitted, which was very little. She died on the 24th of October, 1537, 12 days after Edward was born. She was 28 or 29 years old. Henry was reportedly devastated, or at least performed devastation with a conviction that persuaded most observers. He wore black. He withdrew from the court. He mourned Jane longer and more publicly than he had mourned any of his other wives, and when he died a decade later, he was buried beside her at Windsor, the only one of the six who shared his tomb. Whether the grief was wholly genuine, or whether it was shaped by the knowledge that Jane had given him the son and therefore occupied a unique place in his emotional economy, is a question the sources invite without answering. What is certain is that Jane's death removed the one queen who had shown Mary consistent kindness, and it left the royal household once again without a maternal center. Edward was handed to wet nurses and governesses. Mary returned to her own establishment. Elizabeth remained at Hatfield under Brian's care, and the family that Henry had spent a decade reshaping through law, religion, and coercion settled into a new configuration: a fatherless prince in a nursery, two illegitimate daughters in separate households, and a king who would marry 3 more times: Anne of Cleves in 1540, a disastrous union annulled within 6 months; Catherine Howard in 1540, who would be executed for adultery in 1542; and Catherine Parr in 1543, without producing another surviving child. The years between 1537 and Henry's death in 1547 are the years of partial restoration and permanent damage. Mary lived quietly, her household restored to a level of comfort appropriate to a king's daughter, if not to a princess. She attended court when summoned. She performed the role of the obedient daughter. She never publicly retracted her submission. To do so would have been suicidal. But the evidence of her private correspondence and of Chapuis's report suggests that she never accepted it either. The submission sat on the record like a wound that would not heal. She had signed it. She could not unsign it. She could only endure the knowledge of what it said and wait for a time when the world might change enough to allow her to be once again what she had always believed she was. In 1543, the Third Succession Act returned both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession. Behind Edward, but present, named, and once again potential inheritors of the English crown. The act was passed through Parliament with the support of the Privy Council and with Henry's explicit endorsement. It was significant. It meant that if Edward died without heirs, Mary would become queen. If Mary died without heirs, Elizabeth would become queen. The daughters Henry had twice bastardized were back in the line, not because Henry had reconsidered his treatment of them, but because the practical realities of succession demanded it. Edward was a single child. His health, while good, was not guaranteed. The dynasty needed alternatives, and the alternatives were the two women Henry had spent a decade trying to erase. But the act was also, in a way that cut deeper than its legal provisions, incomplete. Henry did not re-legitimize either daughter. He did not declare Catherine's marriage valid or Anne's marriage valid. He did not repeal the earlier acts of succession that had declared both women bastards. He simply inserted them back into the order of inheritance by parliamentary authority, as if legitimacy were a bureaucratic category that could be switched on and off by statute without reference to the truth of the marriages that had produced them. The act gave Mary and Elizabeth a future. It did not give them back their past. It did not acknowledge that what had been done to them was wrong. It merely acknowledged that they might, in the event of Edward's death, be useful. Catherine Parr, whom Henry married in July 1543, played a role in this rehabilitation that should not be understated. She was a twice-widowed woman of 31, well-educated, Protestant in her sympathies, but diplomatically cautious, and possessed of a maternal warmth that extended to all three of Henry's children. Under Parr's careful stewardship, the royal household became a place where Mary and Elizabeth could coexist with their father in something approaching domestic peace. Elizabeth, now approaching 10, was educated under Parr's supervision by some of the finest humanist tutors in England, Roger Ascham, who would later write of her extraordinary gifts, and William Grindal. And she began to develop the intellectual brilliance and the facility with languages that would later dazzle ambassadors, terrify counselors, and make her one of the most learned monarchs in European history. Mary, in her late 20s, was treated with the respect due to a king's eldest daughter and was given a household and an allowance that, if not lavish, were at least adequate to her dignity. The family gathered at Hampton Court, at Greenwich, at Whitehall, and for brief stretches it resembled something that might, from a distance and in the right light, be called a family. Rearranged, haunted by the absences of dead mothers, scarred by the submissions and the statutes and the years of surveillance, but functional, present, sharing space. Henry VIII died on the 28th of January 1547 at Whitehall Palace. He was 55 years old. His body had been failing for years, the ulcerated leg that never healed and that produced a stench his courtiers learned to endure in silence. The weight that had ballooned from the athletic frame of his youth into something that required special equipment to move, the fevers and infections that recurred with increasing frequency and severity. In his final hours, Cranmer was summoned. Henry was asked to give a sign that he died in the faith of Christ. He squeezed Cranmer's hand. It was the last gesture of a king who had remade the faith of an entire nation to suit his dynastic will. He died believing he had solved the succession. Edward would be king. If Edward died without issue, the crown would pass to Mary. If Mary died without issue, it would pass to Elizabeth. The order was set. The will was written. The Privy Council was instructed. The arrangements, which had cost the English Church its connection to Rome, 2 queens their lives, 2 daughters their legitimacy, and an unknowable number of people their freedom, their positions, and their peace of mind, were in place. The audience, sitting with the story this far, already knows the irony that Henry could not see. The son he had spent a lifetime pursuing would reign for 6 years and die at 15. His body consumed by what was probably tuberculosis, his final months spent in a desperate attempt to bypass his own father's succession plan by disinheriting both of his sisters in favor of the Protestant Lady Jane Grey. The daughters he had tried to erase, the daughters he had bastardized, humiliated, separated from their mothers, forced into submission, and restored to the succession only as a political afterthought, would reign for a combined total of nearly 50 years and would, between them, define the Tudor age in the popular imagination far more completely than the father who had tried to write them out of it. The great project of the male heir, the project that had reshaped the English church, destroyed 2 queens, broken a daughter's resistance, and left a toddler motherless in a household where no one could tell the governess what rank the child now held, would end in the very outcome it had been designed to prevent, the crown passing to the women Henry had tried to eliminate from his story. He had spent his reign deciding which of his daughters counted. History would decide for him. Edward was 9 years old when he became king. He was serious, studious, and Protestant in a way that went beyond the political Protestantism of his father. Edward believed, with the fervor of a boy educated by reformist tutors who had filled his mind with the conviction that the English Reformation was God's work, that the church should move further from Rome, not back toward it. His uncle Edward Seymour, now Duke of Somerset, was appointed Lord Protector and governed in the boy's name, with a combination of ambition and administrative competence that kept the regime functional, if not universally popular. The country Edward inherited was changed but not settled. The religious question that Henry had opened remained open. The monasteries had been dissolved, their lands redistributed to a new class of Protestant gentry who had every financial reason to resist a return to Catholicism. The old faith still had deep roots in the north, in the west, and in the hearts of people who had never understood why the king's marital difficulties should require them to abandon the mass they had known since childhood. England was a country at war with itself over God, and the boy king's personal convictions, then sincere, intense, and increasingly rigid as his health declined, would push that war closer to crisis. Mary, at 31, retreated to her own estates, Hunsdon, Beaulieu, Kenninghall in Norfolk, and watched from a distance that was both cautious and deliberate as the country moved in a direction she found spiritually intolerable. The new religious settlement under Edward pushed the Church of England firmly toward continental Protestantism. Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer was introduced in 1549, replacing the Latin liturgy with English services. Traditional Catholic worship was suppressed. The Mass that Mary had celebrated privately throughout her father's reign became, under her half-brother's government, technically illegal. Mary continued to celebrate it anyway in her private chapel, attended by her household priests, daring the regime to stop her. The Privy Council sent letters. Commissioners arrived with warnings. Mary received them with the same composure she had shown the commissioners who had come to press her father's submission 15 years earlier, and she told them she would obey God before she obeyed any act of Parliament. She had spent her life in defiance of her father. Defiance of her brother's ministers, though she loved Edward himself, was not a significantly different exercise. The muscles of resistance, once trained, did not atrophy. Elizabeth, meanwhile, navigated the years of Edward's reign with the instinct for survival that had been her inheritance from infancy. She was 13 when Henry died, and the teenager of remarkable intelligence and guarded temperament, educated in the humanist tradition by Ascham and Grindal, fluent in Latin, French, and Italian, competent in Greek, and possessed of a self-possession that struck those who met her as uncanny in one so young. She lived for a time in Catherine Parr's household after Henry's death, and it was there that the first serious danger of her post-infancy life materialized. Thomas Seymour, the Lord Protector's younger brother, charming, reckless, and consumed by an ambition that his abilities could not support, had married Parr with unseemly speed after Henry's death and began a pattern of behavior toward the 14-year-old Elizabeth that the household noticed, that Parr eventually confronted, and that historians have debated with increasing discomfort ever since. He entered her bedchamber in the mornings before she was dressed. He tickled her. He slapped her familiarly. On one occasion, in a garden at Hanworth, he cut her gown to pieces while Parr held her, an episode that has been variously interpreted as rough play, as humiliation, and as something that belongs to a vocabulary the 16th century did not possess, but that the modern world recognizes immediately. Elizabeth was sent away from the household. Parr died in September 1548, days after giving birth to a daughter. Thomas Seymour was arrested in January 1549 on charges of treason, plotting to marry Elizabeth without the council's consent, plotting to overthrow his brother, plotting to seize the person of the king, and was executed on the 20th of March. Elizabeth was interrogated by Sir Robert Tyrwhitt, who was sent to extract a confession. She was 15 years old. She gave nothing away. She admitted nothing. She revealed nothing that could be used against her. The lesson of her childhood: watch, wait, say nothing until you understand which way the wind is blowing, had already by 15 hardened into a survival skill that would serve her for the rest of her life. Edward's health began to fail in the winter of 1552. By the spring of 1553, it was clear to the court physicians, to the Privy Council, and to the foreign ambassadors who watched with anxious attention that the king was dying. He was 15. The illness was almost certainly tuberculosis, though the contemporary accounts described symptoms: racking cough, fever, wasting, swollen legs, skin that turned dark, that may have included secondary infections. Edward, aware that he was dying and consumed by the conviction that Mary's accession would destroy the Protestant faith in England, turned his attention to the succession with a single-mindedness that echoed his father's obsession. Working with John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who had replaced the fallen Somerset as the dominant figure in the regime, Edward drafted a device for the succession that bypassed both of his sisters and named Lady Jane Grey, a 15-year-old Protestant great-granddaughter of Henry VII, brilliant, pious, and entirely unprepared for what was about to happen to her. As his heir, Jane was married, hastily and with transparent political purpose, to Northumberland's son Guildford Dudley in May 1553. The marriage was the last piece of Northumberland's plan to keep power in his own hands after Edward's death. Jane herself reportedly wept when told she was to be queen. She did not want it. She would have it for 9 days. Edward died on the 6th of July, 1553, at Greenwich Palace. He was 15 years old. He had reigned for 6 years and 5 months. The son Henry had spent a lifetime pursuing. The son whose birth had justified the destruction of 2 queens, the bastardization of 2 daughters, and the remaking of the English church, was gone. The succession he had attempted to redirect was in crisis, and the woman who would resolve that crisis was the same woman who had been told for 20 years that she did not count. Mary was at Kenninghall in Norfolk when she received word of Edward's death and of the plot to divert the succession to Jane Grey. What she did next was the most decisive act of her life. She did not flee. She did not negotiate. She did not wait for the Privy Council to offer her terms. She proclaimed herself queen, the lawful heir under the Third Succession Act, the daughter of Henry VIII, the woman whose legitimacy had been denied by Parliament and restored by Parliament and denied again and restored again across 2 decades of political violence. And she raised her standard. She summoned the loyalty of East Anglia. The response exceeded anything Northumberland or the Privy Council had anticipated. The gentry of Norfolk and Suffolk rallied to her. The common people, who remembered that she was Catherine of Aragon's daughter and who had never accepted the acts that declared her illegitimate, turned out in numbers that made the regime's position untenable. Ships sent to blockade the coast defected to Mary. Northumberland marched north, with an army that began dissolving as it moved, soldiers and officers slipping away in the night to join the side that was winning. On the 19th of July, the Privy Council in London, the same men who had proclaimed Jane Grey queen 9 days earlier, reversed themselves and proclaimed Mary. Northumberland was arrested, tried, and executed. Jane Grey was sent to the Tower. She was 16. She would be executed there in February 1554. A girl who had been used as a political instrument and discarded when the instrument failed. Mary entered London on the 3rd of August, 1553, riding through streets packed with people who wept and cheered and threw flowers and caps into the air. Observers, ambassadors, city officials, foreign visitors recorded it as the most rapturous reception the city had given any monarch in living memory. The procession moved through streets hung with banners and tapestries, past crowds that had gathered since dawn, through a city that was declaring, in the only language available to common people, that the daughter they had always believed was the rightful heir had come to claim what was hers. Mary rode in a purple velvet gown, her face bright with emotion, acknowledging the crowds with a warmth that those who saw it remembered for years. She was 37 years old. She had waited longer than anyone should have had to wait. She had been bastardized, demoted, separated from her mother, forced to sign away her own identity, watched by hostile household officials, threatened with prosecution for treason, and bypassed in the succession by a dying boy king's desperate gamble. And she had won. The first erased daughter had refused to be erased again. The first act of her first parliament was to declare her parents' marriage valid, her own birth legitimate, and the submission she had signed in June of 1536 null and void. It was the moment Mary had spent 17 years waiting for. The official acknowledgement that Catherine's marriage had been what Catherine always said it was, that Mary was what she had always believed she was, and that the acts which had declared otherwise were unjust. The wound had not healed, but it had at last been formally recognized by the institution, Parliament, that had inflicted it. The irony was not lost on observers. The same parliamentary machinery that Henry and Cromwell had used to bastardize Mary was now being used by Mary to restore herself. Cromwell, of course, was long dead. Executed on Tower Hill on the 28th of July, 1540, on charges of treason and heresy, the victim of the same system of state prosecution he had perfected. He had died badly. The executioner was inexperienced and required multiple strokes. The man who had managed the destruction of 2 queens and the demotion of 2 princesses with such administrative precision was dispatched with none. Mary's reign lasted 5 years, and it was shaped, at every turn, by the same forces that had shaped her childhood. She wanted restoration of the Catholic faith, of the papal connection, of the world her mother had represented and her father had destroyed. She married Philip of Spain, Charles I's son, in July 1554 at Winchester Cathedral, an alliance that gave her a Catholic husband and a powerful European protector, but that provoked deep anxiety in England, where Spanish influence was viewed with something approaching horror. Philip was 11 years her junior, handsome, reserved, and dutiful rather than passionate. Whether Mary loved him is suggested by the evidence, whether he loved her is not. He treated the marriage as a diplomatic obligation. She treated it as the fulfillment of a lifetime's longing for a husband, for a child, for the Spanish connection her mother had represented, for the restoration of everything that had been taken from her. The emotional asymmetry of the marriage echoed the emotional asymmetry of her childhood. Mary giving everything, the other party giving what the situation required and no more. The marriage triggered Wyatt's rebellion in January 1554. An armed uprising in Kent, led by Sir Thomas Wyatt, that marched on London and reached the very gates of the city before being suppressed. The rebellion was fueled by Protestant alarm at the prospect of a Catholic restoration under Spanish influence, and it was the most serious domestic threat Mary's regime would face. Elizabeth was implicated. Whether she had known of the plot in advance or whether her name had simply been used by conspirators who wanted a Protestant figurehead remains one of the unresolved questions of the period. The regime's suspicion was sufficient to send her to the Tower. She entered through the Watergate on Palm Sunday, the 18th of March, 1554, in the rain, carried by barge down the Thames, stepping out onto the wet stones of the landing, and reportedly sitting down and refusing to go further, declaring to her guards that she was no traitor and asking them to witness that she came as a true subject. She was 20 years old. She spent 2 months imprisoned in the fortress where her mother had been killed, sleeping in apartments that looked out toward the green where Anne had knelt for the swordsman, before being moved to house arrest at Woodstock in Oxfordshire, where she was held in a crumbling gatehouse and watched by a keeper she loathed. She survived. She gave nothing away. She endured interrogation, suspicion, and the proximity of death with the self-control that had been trained into her since infancy. She survived because survival was the one skill her childhood had given her in abundance. Mary wanted above all an heir, a Catholic child who would prevent Elizabeth from inheriting the throne and reversing everything Mary had restored. She experienced what appeared to be pregnancy, her abdomen swelling, her physicians cautiously hopeful. But the pregnancies were false, caused perhaps by illness, perhaps by the ferocious intensity of her desire. No child came. The succession remained unsettled. Mary turned to the burning of Protestant heretics. Nearly 300 men and women sent to the fires between 1555 and 1558 in a campaign of persecution that earned her the name Bloody Mary and that has defined her reputation ever since. The burnings were real, the suffering was real, and the damage to Mary's legacy was permanent and arguably deserved. But they were also the actions of a woman who believed, with the absolute conviction of someone who had suffered for her faith and had been proved right, that heresy was a disease and that the disease must be burned out of the body of Christ. The rigidity that had sustained her through the years of persecution had become, in power, an inability to see that the world had moved beyond the point where restoration was possible. The England Mary wanted to rebuild no longer existed. The monasteries were gone, their lands in new hands. The gentry who had profited from the dissolution would not return their gains. The Protestant faith had taken root in London, in the universities, in the hearts of people who would not be burned into submission. Mary could not see this. The wound was too deep. The vision of the world Catherine had given her was too fixed. She pursued the old world with the same tenacity she had once used to resist the new one, and the result was a reign that history has judged harshly and that deserves at the very least the compassion of understanding why. Mary died on the 17th of November, 1558, at St. James's Palace. She was 42 years old. She died without the heir she had desperately wanted, without the Catholic succession she had spent her reign trying to secure, and with the knowledge, unspoken but present in the room like the November cold, that everything she had restored would be undone by the half-sister who would follow her. Philip had returned to Spain. The court was quiet. The reign that had begun with the most rapturous welcome London had ever given a monarch ended in an atmosphere of exhaustion, failure, and the particular loneliness of a woman who had tried to rebuild a world that no longer existed. Elizabeth was at Hatfield when the news arrived. The same Hatfield where she had been a toddler in a household organized around her, and then a child stripped of rank and watched by the Sheltons, and then a teenager navigating the perilous politics of her brothers' and sisters' reigns. She was 25 years old. According to the account that has passed into history, she fell to her knees in the November grass beneath an oak tree and quoted Psalm 118. "This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes." The second, erased daughter had reached the throne. Elizabeth's reign would last 45 years, in from 1550 to 1603, and it would become, in popular memory, the defining era of Tudor England. The Elizabethan age, Shakespeare, Marlowe, Drake, Raleigh, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the flowering of English literature and exploration and national confidence. But the woman at the center of that age was not the serene icon that later portraiture made her appear. She was the daughter of a queen who had been executed when she was 2, the half-sister of a queen who had imprisoned her in the Tower, the survivor of a childhood in which identity was a category that could be altered by statute and safety, was a condition that could be revoked by a commission carrying paperwork. She never married. The reasons have been debated for centuries: political calculation, personal trauma, the example of her father's marriages, the knowledge that marriage for a Tudor queen was a transaction in which the woman's autonomy was the first thing bargained away. Elizabeth herself, when pressed by Parliament and by her counselors to name a husband and secure the succession, gave answers that were masterpieces of evasion: warm, eloquent, and entirely non-committal. She was married to England, she told them. The ring on her finger at her coronation was her wedding band. The rhetoric was magnificent. The evasion was absolute. She governed with an intelligence and a political instinct that awed her contemporaries and that historians have analyzed ever since. She chose her counselors carefully. William Cecil, later Lord Burghley, served her for 40 years with a loyalty and a competence that anchored her regime. She managed Parliament with a combination of charm, stubbornness, and strategic delay that kept the institution useful without allowing it to become dominant. She maintained the Protestant settlement her father and brother had created, but without the ferocity of Edward's reformers or the cruelty of Mary's counter-reformation. She refused, as she reportedly phrased it, to make windows into men's souls, a policy that allowed Catholics to practice their faith privately, so long as they observed the outward forms of conformity that the state required. The policy was pragmatic. It was also perhaps the inheritance of a woman who had learned in childhood that the enforcement of belief through coercion destroyed the people it was supposed to save. The Roman Catholics of Europe never fully accepted her legitimacy. To them, she remained what Henry's second act of succession had declared her: the illegitimate daughter of a void marriage, the child of a woman executed for treason and adultery. That shadow followed Elizabeth throughout her reign, manifesting in papal bulls of excommunication, in assassination plots funded by Catholic powers, and in the long, agonizing question of Mary, Queen of Scots, the Catholic great-granddaughter of Henry VII, whose claim to the English throne was, in the eyes of Rome, stronger than Elizabeth's own. Mary Stuart was imprisoned in England for 19 years before Elizabeth finally, reluctantly, signed the warrant for her execution in 1587. The decision haunted Elizabeth. She had seen what happened to queens in the Tower. She knew what it meant to order a woman's death. The echoes of her own childhood, the mother she had lost to the executioner's sword, the childhood spent learning that power could destroy anyone, were audible in her hesitation and in the distress she displayed after the execution was carried out. Henry's attempt to rewrite his daughter's identities had consequences that outlived him by half a century. The legitimacy question he had created was never fully answered. It was simply overtaken by events, by time, and by the stubborn fact that Elizabeth was on the throne and no one could remove her. Elizabeth died on the 24th of March, 1603, at Richmond Palace. She was 69 years old. She had reigned for 45 years. She had never named a successor. That final evasion, that ultimate refusal to commit, carried to the grave. The crown passed, by the arrangements her counselors had quietly prepared, to James VI of Scotland, the Protestant son of the Catholic Mary Stuart, whom Elizabeth had executed. The Tudor dynasty was finished. It had lasted 118 years from Bosworth Field to Richmond Palace, and it ended not through the male line Henry had spent his life pursuing, but through the female line he had spent his life trying to suppress. The popular screen memory of these events still most often tells the story through the adults who surrounded the daughters rather than through the daughters themselves. Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall and its sequel, Bring Up the Bodies, adapted by the BBC in 2015 with Mark Rylance as Cromwell, Damian Lewis as Henry, and Claire Foy as Anne Boleyn, centered the narrative on Cromwell's experience of the Henrician court. His intelligence, his ambition, his capacity for both loyalty and ruthlessness, and his own eventual destruction in 1540, when the same machinery of state prosecution he had built was turned against him over the disastrous marriage to Anne of Cleves. Mary appeared in the adaptation, played by Lilith Lesser, as a figure of stubborn piety observed from the outside. The difficult political problem Cromwell was tasked with managing, not the damaged young woman the audience of this documentary has come to know. Mantle's achievement was considerable, but the lens was Cromwell's, and the daughters existed within it as figures to be dealt with rather than as people to be understood. The Tudors, which ran on Showtime from 2007 to 2010, with Jonathan Rhys-Meyers as a brooding, sexually magnetic Henry, gave Mary a more substantial narrative presence through Sarah Bolger's performance across the later seasons. Bolger captured something of Mary's stubbornness and her grief, and the series allowed the viewer to see the demotion and the submission from closer to Mary's perspective than most screen treatments had managed. But the Tudors remained Henry's story, told from Henry's throne room and Henry's bedchamber, with the wives and the daughters as consequences of his choices rather than as agents of their own fates. The series ended with Henry's death, leaving both daughters' reigns untold. Becoming Elizabeth, the 2022 Starz series created by Anya Rice and starring Alicia von Rydberg as Elizabeth and Romola Garai as Mary, made the most decisive shift, setting its action after Henry's death and placing Elizabeth's precarious youth at the center of the narrative. The Thomas Seymour crisis was rendered with uncomfortable clarity. The politics of survival under Edward's Protestant regime were shown through Elizabeth's eyes. Garai's Mary carried the weight of the older sister's accumulated grief and suspicion. The series came closer than any previous dramatization to telling the story from inside the damage through the experience of the women who inherited it. What none of these works has fully captured, what this documentary has attempted to render across its full length, is the central insight that the damage was not incidental to Henry's reign. It was the mechanism. The daughters were not collateral casualties of the succession crisis. They were its deliberate targets. And the psychological inheritance they carried into their reigns, Mary's rigidity and conviction, Elizabeth's ambiguity and caution, both of them responses to the same paternal violence, both of them strategies for surviving the same fundamental wound, was not merely biographical detail. It was the engine of their governance, the explanation for their choices, and the pattern that gives the Tudor story its lasting emotional power. What remains of the Tudor dynasty is not a family. All three of Henry's surviving legitimate children reigned consecutively, and none left descendants. Edward died at 15, unmarried. Mary died at 42, her pregnancies false, her husband returned to Spain, her restoration undone within months of her death. Elizabeth never married and died at 69, the last of the Tudor line. The crown passed to the Stuart dynasty, a Scottish house descended from Henry VII's daughter Margaret, and the Tudor name, which had been won on a battlefield and sustained through statute and violence and the extraordinary tenacity of two women who had every reason to give up, passed out of the succession forever. There are no direct Tudor descendants. There is no Tudor family seat to visit in the way one might visit Chatsworth or Blenheim. What remains is institutional. The Church of England, which Henry created to escape a marriage and which became one of the defining structures of English national identity, its cathedrals and parish churches still standing, its Book of Common Prayer still read. The parliamentary sovereignty that grew from the Reformation Parliament's unprecedented assertion of legislative power over the Church, the succession, and the definition of who was and was not legitimate, a sovereignty that echoes in the constitutional monarchy to this day. The palaces remain, or some of them do. Hampton Court, with its Tudor kitchens and its astronomical clock in the Chapel Royal, where Edward was christened while his sister stood in attendance. The Tower of London, where Anne Boleyn was killed and where Elizabeth was imprisoned, and where the stones remember what happened in them even when the tourists have gone home. Greenwich, where Mary and Elizabeth were both born, is now the site of the old Royal Naval College and the National Maritime Museum. Kimbleton Castle, where Catherine died, is now a school. Hatfield House, rebuilt in 1611, the original Tudor palace largely gone, stands in Hertfordshire, and the oak tree under which Elizabeth supposedly received the news of Mary's death is still pointed out to visitors, though the tree itself is unlikely to be the original. What remains above all is the pattern. And the pattern is what this story has been about from the beginning. Henry VIII believed he could solve dynastic instability by deciding which of his daughters counted and which did not. He used parliament, the church, the household, the law of treason, and the daily mechanics of rank and address to convert living children into administrative categories, legitimate or illegitimate, princess or lady, heir or nobody, as if identity were a matter of paperwork, and as if obedience could be made to substitute for love. Instead of securing the dynasty, he created two women who spent their reigns answering the damage he had done to them in childhood. Mary answered it with rigidity and restoration, with the unshakable conviction that the old world could be rebuilt if only the right statutes were passed and the right prayers were said. Elizabeth answered it with ambiguity and control, with the hard-won understanding that the world her father had broken could not be reassembled, and that the safest course was to manage the ruins. There is no neat moral in that. Only the enduring fact that the Tudor dynasty ended not through the son Henry wanted, but through the daughters he tried to erase, and that the hand which signed the submission in June of 1536, the hand of a 20-year-old woman brought to the document by isolation, illness, and the threat of death, belonged to the same woman who would one day ride into London as queen, undo the submission by act of parliament, and spend the rest of her life trying to repair what that signature had cost her.